Hello, we are live. Let me just start setting this up here. We're going to be reading The Hobbit today. Welcome to another stream. Let me just set up the PG warning for today. Just pin that. Okay, that should work. Let's get the word out. I've been trying my best to save my voice today for this, because reading streams are very harsh on the voice. A gaming stream, there's moments of respite where you're not talking so much, but not so much in a reading stream. But I have extra water here with me today to keep myself and my throat both hydrated and lubricated and everything. Facebook is not really behaving all that well right now. Let's try refreshing it. That did it. Hey Moogle, how goes it today? You know, as per usual for the Tolkien streams, we'll want you and the other mods to just keep an eye out for any sort of adult language. You could just delete it. You don't need to time anybody out or ban anybody unless it's habitual, because I know normally we're a little more liberal with that sort of thing. But, you know, because this is going on the YouTube, I'll want to make sure that it's a little bit more stringent, since that's a family-friendly channel. How are you doing today? So I believe we left off... I had read Queer Lodgings, correct? I think I have to check. You're hungry, huh? I just had dinner. I had some chicken salad sandwiches. I feel like I'm not sure. I think I need to review the VOD here, because I believe that I read the chapter called Queer Lodgings, where they stayed with Bjorn, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Chicken nuggets is always fun. Well, here's the part 2. It's hard to mess up chicken nuggets. I just want to go to the end of the video and see what... Trudging for miles and miles with all that on his back. Don't you worry, said Thorin. It will get lighter all too soon. Before long, I expect we shall all wish our pack... That sounds correct. That sounds like they were, Yeah, that's Queer Lodgings. Okay, so that means we're at Chapter 8, Flies and Spiders, which means that we are, as you can see, halfway through. So hopefully we can get through this in 2 more streams, today and then another stream next month. I'm not entirely sure, because the deeper you get into this, the more there is to talk about. Hey, no problem. No problem. Yeah, I see Bobby's in the chat. Hey, Bobby. But yeah, I believe that's where we were at. Flies and Spiders. So we're going to start there in just a little bit. We're going to read The Hobbit. But yeah, People have been very well behaved in these streams. We haven't had any sort of issue at all. So I don't anticipate that there's going to be an issue at all. But I definitely want the moderators to be keeping an eye out anyway. I'm going to lower the music a bit. I'm not going to have the music while I'm reading anyway, but it's just... It gets louder randomly, this playlist. It's just so strange. But yeah, as long as we have at least one moderator in the chat to keep an eye on things, you know? Hey, Alice. So, we're not going to be sitting here for very long. I want to start pretty quickly because, like I said, I'd like to knock out The Hobbit in 2 more streams. So we have Flies and Spiders. We have, which is a long chapter, by the way. We have Barrels Out of Bond. We have A Warm Welcome, On the Doorstep, Inside Information, Not at Home, Fire and Water, The Gathering of the Clouds, A Thief in the Night, and The Clouds Burst is the big climax, and then The Return Journey and The Last Stage are sort of the denouement there, so... The thing is, like I said, the further you get into the book, the more there is to actually talk about. So, you know, there's that. But anyway, guys, let's actually get started right now. Let's just jump in. I'm not really wanting to stay here and gab too much longer, so we're going to come over here. I'm going to fade out the music, and we're going to get right into at least the recap. So where we left off, of course, I'll give a recap of the entire first half of the book real quick. Yapping has ceased, right? And then I will yap for the next 2.5 hours. So Bilbo Baggins is our titular hobbit, and he has been approached by a wizard named Gandalf to go on an adventure with 13 dwarves. And they go off on this adventure to hopefully defeat a dragon named Smaug, who has taken over the mountain where the dwarves lived and taken their gold and such. And Bilbo's role in this is to be sort of the thief of the group, the rogue, the burglar, as Tolkien puts it. And they have encountered some trolls. They got some very special weapons. They stayed with the elves in Rivendell, and they went under the Misty Mountains where Bilbo met Gollum and obtained the One Ring. Of course, he doesn't know it's the One Ring. He would be pretty horrified to know of its origin at this part in the story. Right now, he just thinks that it's a magic ring that he found that makes him invisible. And then they stayed with Beorn after being rescued by eagles, and they're about to head into Mirkwood Forest. So without further ado, let's start with Chapter 8, Flies and Spiders. They walked in single file. The entrance to the path was like a sort of arch, leading into a gloomy tunnel made by 2 great trees that leant together, too old and strangled with ivy and hung with lichen to bear more than a few blackened leaves. The path itself was narrow and wound in and out among the trunks. Soon the light at the gate was like a little bright hole far behind, and the quiet was so deep that their feet seemed to thump along while all the trees leaned over them and listened. As their eyes became used to the dimness, they could see a little way to either side in a sort of a darkened green glimmer. Occasionally a slender beam of sun that had luck to slip in through some opening in the leaves far above, and still more luck in not being caught in the tangled boughs and matted twigs beneath, stabbed down thin and bright before them. But this was seldom, and it soon ceased altogether. There were black squirrels in the wood. As Bilbo's sharp, inquisitive eyes got used to seeing things, he could catch glimpses of them whisking off the path and scuttling behind tree trunks. There were queer noises, too, grunts, scufflings, and hurryings in the undergrowth, and among the leaves that lay piled endlessly thick in places on the forest floor. But what made the noises he could not see. The nastiest things they saw were the cobwebs. Dark, dense cobwebs with threads extraordinarily thick, often stretched from tree to tree or tangled in the lower branches on either side of them. There were none stretched across the path, but whether because some magic kept it clear, or for what other reason, they could not guess. It was not long before they grew to hate the forest as heartily as they had hated the tunnels of the goblins, and it seemed to offer even less hope of any ending. but they had to go on and on, long after they were sick for a sight of the sun and of the sky, and longed for the feel of wind on their faces. There was no movement of air down under the forest roof, and it was everlastingly still and dark and stuffy. Even the dwarves felt it, who were used to tunneling, and lives at times for long whiles without light of the sun. But the hobbit, who liked holes to make a house in, but not to spend summer days in, felt that he was being slowly suffocating. The weather's getting nasty. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm going to pause here and just speak specifically about the cobwebs. And they speak about how the webs are not going across the path, and that it's unknown if this is some form of magic, or whether it's perhaps coincidental, or whether there are people that keep the path clear. This is a secret path. It's not the main path through Mirkwood Forest. They were going to take the main path, and Bjorn told them that's no good because the place where the main path goes is now a swamp, and it's impassable, and you can't get through there, and it's far too south for you'd have to just start cutting north as soon as you got out, if you were able to get out, because it ends in a swamp. But there is a secret road. Now, what he doesn't tell them is that this is maintained by the wood elves, and that leads to the problems a bit later in the chapter. The road less taken is, this is a very, very secret path. It's described as winding, it's dark, it's narrow, it's unpleasant, and one must wonder how Bjorn even knows about it. But what's most interesting is the cobwebs. They don't go across the path, and I would say that it probably is a form of elven magic, because this is an elf path. And the spiders are the children of Shelob. And Shelob in Mordor right now, or right outside the border of Mordor, near a place called Cirith Ungol, is the daughter of a malevolent spirit known as Ungoliant. And Ungoliant was so powerful that she almost killed the first Dark Lord Morgoth in the First Age, in her rage. And she was sort of like a walking black hole. The only thing that could do her in was her own hunger, and she consumed herself, and that's how she died. But she had children, and the last daughter of her to plague this unhappy world was Shelob, and it was mentioned in The Lord of the Rings that many of the spiders in Mirkwood are, in fact, Shelob's children and grandchildren and such. So these are very evil creatures, because Ungoliant was a being of pure darkness and pure evil. And then she mated with other spirits that came out of the depths of the earth. The unnamed things that Gandalf alludes to in the next book. And that they had taken spider form, and she mated with them, and that's what created Shelob and all of Shelob's brothers and sisters and children and such. Oh no, that sounds unpleasant. Hopefully you had proper protection there, Zeldaman, that it wasn't too bad, like lots of padding and such. But okay, let's continue along. So I just wanted to really comment on the cobwebs and the spiders. We're going to be intimately familiar with the spiders by the end of this chapter, and I remember when I first read this when I was a young lad of about 7 years old. The spider part is really what stuck with me. Well, glad to hear you're not seriously injured, Zelda man. That would suck. I've never done LARPing or anything like that, but I heard it can get pretty rough at times. The nights were the worst. It then became pitch dark. Not what you would call pitch dark, but really pitch. So black that you could really see nothing. Bilbo tried flapping his hand in front of his nose, but he could not see it at all. Well, perhaps it is not true to say that they couldn't see nothing. They could see eyes. They slept all closely huddled together, and took it in turns to watch, and when it was Bilbo's turn, he would see gleams in the darkness round them, and sometimes pairs of yellow or red or green eyes would stare at him from a little distance. and then slowly fade and disappear and slowly shine out again in another place. And sometimes they would gleam down from the branches just above him, and that was most terrifying. But the eyes that he liked the least were the horrible, pale, bulbous sort of eyes. Insect eyes, he thought, not animal eyes. Only they are much too big. Although it was not yet very cold, they tried lighting watchfires at night, but they soon gave that up. It seemed to bring hundreds and hundreds of eyes all around them, though the creatures, whatever they were careful never to let their bodies show in the little flicker of the flames. Worse still, it brought thousands of dark gray and black moths, some nearly as big as your hand, flapping and whirring about their ears. They could not stand that, nor the huge bats, black as a top hat, either. So they gave up fires and sat at night and dozed in the enormous, uncanny darkness. All this went on for what seemed to the hobbit ages upon ages, and he was always hungry, for they were extremely careful with their provisions. Even so, as days followed days, and still the forest seemed just the same, they began to get anxious. The food would not last forever. It was in fact already beginning to get low. They tried shooting at the squirrels, and they wasted many arrows before they managed to bring one down on the path. But when they roasted it, it proved horrible to taste, and they shot no more squirrels. They were thirsty, too, for they had none too much water, and in all the time they had seen neither spring nor stream. This was their state when one day they found their path blocked by running water. It flowed fast and strong, but not very wide, right across the way, and it was black, or looked it in the gloom. It was well that Bjorn had warned them against it, or they would have drunk from it, wherever its color, and filled some of their emptied skins at its bank. As it was, they only thought of how to cross it without wetting themselves in its water. There had been a bridge of wood across, but it had rotted and fallen, leaving only the broken posts near the bank. Bilbo, kneeling on the brink and peering forward, cried, "There is a boat against the far bank. Now why couldn't it have been on this side?" "How far away do you think it is?" asked Thorin, for by now they knew Bilbo had the sharpest eyes among them. Not at all far. I shouldn't think about 12 yards. Okay, Alice, we hope to see you soon. 12 yards! I should have thought it was 30 at least, but my eyes don't see as well as they used to 100 years ago. Still, 12 yards is as good as a mile. We can't jump it, and we daren't try to wade or swim. Can any of you throw a rope? What good is that? The boat is sure to be tied up, even if we could hook it, which I doubt. I don't believe it is tied, said Bilbo, though of course I can't be sure in this light, but it looks to me as if it were just drawn up on the bank, which is low just there where the path goes down into the water. Dori is the strongest, but Fili is the youngest and still has the best sight, said Thorin. Come here, Fili. See if you can see the boat Mr. Baggins is talking about. Fili thought he could, so when he had stared a long while to get an idea of the direction, the others brought him a rope. They had several with them, and on the end of the longest they fastened one of the large iron hooks they had used for catching their packs to the straps about their shoulders. Fili took this in his hand, balanced it for a moment, and then flung it across the stream. Splash! It fell in the water. Not far enough, said Bilbo, who was peering forward. A couple of feet, and you would have dropped it onto the boat. Try again. I don't suppose this magic is strong enough to hurt you, if you just touch a bit of wet rope. Fili picked up the hook when he had drawn it back, rather doubtfully all the same. This time he threw it with greater strength. Steady, said Bilbo. You've thrown it right into the wood on the other side now. Draw it back gently. Fili hauled the rope back slowly, and after a while Bilbo said, Carefully, it is lying on the boat. Let's hope the hook will catch. It did. The rope went taut, and Fili pulled in vain. Kili came to his help, and then Oin and Gloin. They tugged, and suddenly they all fell over on their backs. Bilbo was on the lookout, however, caught the rope, and with a piece of stick fended off the little black boat as it came rushing across the stream. Help! He shouted, and Balin was just in time to seize the boat before it floated off down the current. It was tied after all, said he, looking at the snapped painter that was still dangling from it. That was a good pull, my lads, and a good job that our rope was the stronger. Who will cross first? Said Bilbo. I shall, said Thorin, and you will come with me, and Fili and Balin. That's as many as the boat will hold at a time. After that, Kili and Oin and Gloin and Dori. Next, Ori, Nori, Bifur and Bofur. And last, Waylin and Bombur. I'm always last, and I don't like it, said Bombur. It's somebody else's turn today. You should not be so fat. As you are, you must be with the last and lightest boast load. Don't start grumbling against orders, or something bad will happen to you. There aren't any oars. How are you going to push the boat back to the far bank? Asked the hobbit. Give me another length of rope and another hook, said Fili. And when they had got it ready, he cast it into the darkness ahead and as high as he could throw it. Since it did not fall down again, they saw that it must have struck in the branches. "Get it now," said Philly, "and one of you haul on the rope that is stuck in a tree on the other side. One of the others must keep hold of the hook we used at first, and when we are safe on the other side, he can hook it on, and then you can draw the boat back." In this way they were all soon on the far bank, safe across the enchanted stream. Dwalin had just scrambled out with the coiled rope in his arm, and Bombur, still grumbling, was getting ready to follow, when something bad did happen. There was a flying sound of hooves in the path ahead. Out of the gloom came suddenly the shape of a flying deer. It charged into the dwarves and bowled them over, then gathered itself for a leap. High it sprang and cleared the water with a mighty jump, but it did not reach the other side in safety. Thorin was the only one who had kept his feet and his wits. As soon as he had landed, he had bent his bow and fitted an arrow just in case any hidden guardian of the boat appeared. Now he sent a swift and sure shot into the leaping beast. As it reached the further bank, it stumbled. The shadows swallowed it up, but they heard the sound of hooves quickly falter and then go still. Before they could shout in praise of the shot, however, a dreadful wail from Bilbo put all thoughts of venison out of their minds. "Bombur has fallen in! Bombur is drowning!" he cried. It was only too true. Bombur had only 1 foot on the land when the heart bore down on him and sprang over him. He had stumbled, thrusting the boat away from the bank, and then toppled back into the dark water, his hands slipping off the slimy roots at the edge, while the boat span slowly off and disappeared. They could still see his hood above the water when they ran to the bank. Quickly they flung a rope with a hook towards him. His hand caught it, and they pulled him to the shore. He was drenched from hair to boots, of course, but that was not the worst. When they laid him on the bank, he was already fast asleep, with one hand clutching at the rope so tight that they could not get it from his grasp, and fast asleep he remained in spite of all they could do. They were still standing over him, cursing their ill luck and Bombur's clumsiness, and lamenting the loss of their boat, which made it impossible for them to go back and look for the heart, when they became aware of the dim blowing of horns in the wood, and the sound as of dogs baying far off. Then they all fell silent, and as they sat it seemed they could hear the noise of a great hunt going by to the north of the path, though they saw no sign of it. There they sat for a long while and did not dare to make a move. Bombur slept on with a smile on his fat face, as if he no longer cared for all the troubles that vexed them. Suddenly on the path ahead appeared some white deer, a hind and fawns as snowy white as the heart had been dark. They glimmered in the shadows. Before Thorin could cry out, 3 of the dwarves had leaped to their feet and loosed out off arrows from their bows. None seemed to find their mark. The deer turned and vanished in the trees as silently as they had come, and in vain the dwarves shot their arrows after them. "Stop! Stop!" shouted Thorin, but it was too late. The excited dwarves had wasted their last arrows, and now the bows that Bjorn had given them were useless. They were a gloomy party that night, and the gloom gathered still deeper on them in the following days. They had crossed the enchanted stream, but beyond it the path seemed to straggle on just as before, and in the forest they could see no change. Yet if they had known more about it, and considered the meaning of the hunt and the white deer that appeared upon their path, they would have known that they were at last drawing towards the eastern edge, and would soon have come, if they could have kept up their courage and their hope, to thinner trees and places where sunlight came again. But they did not know this, and they were burdened with the heavy body of Bombur, which they had to carry along with them as best they could, taking in the wearisome task in terms of 4 each, while the others shared their packs. If these had not become all too light in the last few days, they would never have managed it, but a slumbering and smiling Bombur was a poor exchange for packs filled with food, however heavy. In a few days, a time came when there was practically nothing left to eat or drink. Nothing wholesome could they see growing in the wood, only funguses and herbs with pale leaves and unpleasant smell. So, let's stop here for a moment and talk about this. So, we get the feeling here that Mirkwood is just a really, really unpleasant place. It's dark, it's gloomy, it's an old-growth forest, and it's not the only old-growth forest that Tolkien has us visit in the Third Age, because we also, in The Lord of the Rings, we visit the Old Forest near the Shire. It's literally called the Old Forest, and Fangorn Forest, far to the south. And I would also say, to an extent, that Lothlorien counts as an old-growth forest, although Lothlorien is more tended to. It's the realm of Galadriel. It's under the protection of her ring of power and such. Mirkwood, on the other hand, was not always this unpleasant. It's dark. It's nasty. There's these spiders and whatever the eyes are that gather around, especially when they light their fires, the moths and the bats and everything, and the black squirrels that aren't even good to eat. But Mirkwood was once a wonderful place. It was called Greenwood Forest in the first age and in the second age. But then in the third age, Sauron came to live in a place called it became known as Dol Guldur. It was originally called Amon Blanc, which means Bald Hill, which was to the south. And that's actually where the Elven kingdom of Greenwood Forest, the woodland realm, as they call it, was originally founded, and that was their capital, Amon Blanc, rather. And they started moving to the north because of a bunch of different reasons. But what happened was the fortress that they had there was taken up by a necromancer, and this is the same necromancer that was mentioned in the previous chapter, and the reason that they could not go to the south around the forest. Gandalf told them, you can't go around to the north because there's a lot of orcs, and you can't go around to the south because that's where the necromancer is, and that was enough to make Thorin shudder with fear. And if you think about it, Thorin is a guy at this point that is heading towards Erebor, and he's going there with purpose, knowing that there's a dragon there. But the necromancer is something that he'd rather avoid. So it's sort of interesting to show that this necromancer, which we don't really know much about right now, we do know later that it's Sauron, but at this point we just know him as the necromancer, is so scary, so deadly, that the idea of going to the dragon is more appealing to Thorin. Thorin's not as afraid of the dragon as he is of the necromancer. And it's the darkness of Sauron that is spreading throughout the realm of Greenwood Forest, which became known as Mirkwood because of how murky and gloomy and dark it became. And that's why the spiders are here, because wherever Sauron is, there are always going to be evil creatures that are going to become attracted to him, that they're going to want to be where he is, that they're going to want to be in the darkness and around the evil magic and such. All right, so we're going to continue. Oh, actually, before we continue, and the sounds of the hunt, the baying of dogs and the hunting to the north, we can infer that is in fact Thranduil's people, the Wood Elves. A bit later, they are having a feast in the forest, so we could assume this is where they get their meat. That they were probably hunting deer because there were deer running down from that side of the path. And then, Thorin did manage to shoot a deer, but as they said, a hart, which we would understand to be a stag. And then shortly after that was a doe and several fawns, and they couldn't quite manage to shoot that, nor could they find the fallen deer that Thorin had shot. So this opportunity to get a whole lot of food very quickly has passed them by, and they are in desperate straits. And it's also mentioned that they're actually at this point pretty close to the edge of the forest. And I'm going to bring up actually the map. I'm going to bring up the map here. Let me just give me one moment here, and we'll put it on the screen. I'm going to bring up the map here so that we could kind of show where we're at in the story and where we've come from and where we're going to. So, I actually don't have a way of doing that on this screen, do I? Well, I could borrow it from not over there. I could borrow it from over here. Let me just copy that and paste it. Where is that? That's the display capture. So let me, we'll copy that, and then we'll come back to the Hobbit screen, and I'll paste a reference here, and we'll show that. So I'm going to have to zoom in here, but here in this place called Eriador, it also says Arnor here is where the Shire is. And it's in this area here called Arthedain. And if you look right around here is where Bilbo is, and then we have followed it this way. And here is where Rivendell is, where they stayed with the dwarves. And then they went over the mountains. However, they wound up at a place called the Carrick, which is down here. And they traveled down here from Eagles, and then they traveled up this way to where Bjorn is, and then this is the main path here. But they're not using this path, they're using this path. And right now, they're right around here. Right around here. And you can see they've made it almost all the way through. The issue is that there's a valley here. And we'll see there's a section coming up where Bilbo climbs to the top of the trees, and because they're in a valley, he's not seeing the edge of the forest. It just seems to go on forever in every direction. So they sort of lose hope. And I wanted to bring that up and kind of show the map. That wasn't the greatest map, but there you have it. All right, we're going to continue along here. About 4 days from the enchanted stream, they came to a part where most of the trees were beeches. They were at first inclined to be cheered by the change, for here there was no undergrowth, and the shadow was not so deep. There was a greenish light about them, and in places they could see some distance to either side of the path. Yet the light only showed them endless lines of straight grey trunks, like the pillars of some huge twilight hall. There was a breath of air and a noise of wind, but it had a sad sound. A few leaves came rustling down to remind them that outside autumn was coming on. Their feet ruffled among the dead leaves of countless other autumns that drifted over the banks of the path from their deep red carpets of the forest. Still Bombur slept, and they grew very weary. At times they had heard disquieting laughter. Sometimes there was singing in the distance, too. The laughter was the laughter of fair voices, not of goblins, and the singing was beautiful. But it sounded eerie and strange, and they were not comforted. Rather, they hurried on from these parts, with what strength they had left. 2 days later, they found their path going downwards, and before long they were in a valley filled almost entirely with a mighty growth of oaks. So just a pause there. This backs up all the things that I had said. They're going downhill, they're going into a valley, a bit more light is coming in. They really should have realized that they were near the edge of the forest, but hunger and thirst and weariness from having to carry Bombur, who is just basically dead weight at this point, is really messing with them. But the signs are there that they are almost all the way through. "Is there no end to this accursed forest?" said Thorin. "Somebody must climb a tree to see if he can get his head above the roof and have a look around. The only way is to choose the tallest tree that overhangs the path." Of course, somebody meant Bilbo. They chose him because to be of any use, the climber must get his head above the topmost leaves, and so he must be light enough for the highest and slenderest branches to bear him. Poor Mr. Baggins had never had much practice in climbing trees, but they hoisted him up to the lowest branches of an enormous oak that grew right out into the path, and up he had to go as best he could. He pushed his way through the tangled twigs, with so many a slap in the eye. He was greened and grimed from the old bark of the greater boughs. More than once he slipped and caught himself just in time, and at last, after a dreadful struggle in a difficult place, where there had seemed to be no convenient branches at all, he got near the top. All the time he was wondering whether there were spiders in the tree and how he was going to get down, except by falling. In the end, he poked his head above the roof of leaves, and then he found spiders all right. But they were only small ones of ordinary size, and they were after the butterflies. Bilbo's eyes were nearly blinded by the light. He could hear the dwarves shouting up at him from far below, but he could not answer, only hold on and blink. The sun was shining brilliantly, and it was a long while before he could bear it. When he could, he saw all around him a sea of dark green, ruffled here and there by the breeze, and there was everywhere hundreds of butterflies. I expect they were a kind of purple emperor, a butterfly that loves the tops of oak woods. But these were not purple at all. They were a dark, velvety black without any markings to be seen. He looked at the black emperors for a long time, and enjoyed the feel of the breeze in his hair and on his face, but at length the cries of the dwarves, who were now simply stamping with impatience down below, reminded him of his real business. It was no good. Gaze as much as he might, he could see no end to the trees and the leaves in any direction. His heart, that had been lightened by the sight of the sun and the feel of the wind, sank below his toes. There was no food to go back to down below. Actually, as I have told you, they were not far off the edge of the forest, and if Bilbo had had the sense to see it, the tree that he had climbed, though it was tall in itself, was standing near the bottom of a wide valley, so that from its top the trees seemed to swell up all round the edges of a great bowl. He could not expect to see how far the forest lasted. Still, he did not see this, and he climbed down full of despair. He got to the bottom again at last, scratched, hot, and miserable, and he could not see anything in the gloom below when he got there. His report soon made the others as miserable as he was. Just get comfortable here. I'm sorry, guys. The forest goes on forever and ever and ever in all directions. Whatever shall we do? And what is the use of sending a hobbit? They cried, as if it was his fault. They did not care tuppence about the butterflies, and were only made more angry when he told them of the beautiful breeze, which they were too heavy to climb up and feel. That night they ate their very last scraps and crumbs of food, and next morning, when they woke, the first thing they noticed was that they were all still gnawingly hungry. And the next thing was that it was raining, and there had been a drip of it was dropping heavy on the forest floor. That only reminded them that they were also parchingly thirsty. Without doing anything to relieve them, you cannot quench a terrible thirst by standing under giant oaks and waiting for a chance drip to fall on your tongue. The only scrap of comfort there that came unexpectedly from Bombur. He woke up suddenly and sat up scratching his head. He could not make out where he was at all, nor why he felt so hungry, for he had forgotten everything that had happened since they started their journey that May morning long ago. The last thing that he remembered was the party at the Hobbit's house, and they had great difficulty in making him believe their tale of all the many adventures they had since. When he heard that there was nothing to eat, he sat down and wept, for he felt very weak and wobbly in the legs. "Why ever did I wake up?" he cried. "I was having such beautiful dreams. I dreamed I was walking in a forest rather like this one, only lit with torches on the trees, and lamps swinging from the branches, and fires burning on the ground, and there was a great feast going on forever. A woodland king was there with a crown of leaves, and there was a merry singing, and I could not count or describe the things there were to eat and drink." "You need not try," said Thorin. "In fact, if you can't talk about something else, you'd better be silent. We're quite annoyed enough with you as it is. If you hadn't waked up, we should have left you to your idiotic dreams in the forest. You are no joke to carry, even after weeks of short commons." There was nothing now to be done but to tighten the belts around their empty stomachs, and hoist their sacks and packs, and trudge along the track without any great hope of ever getting to the end before they lay down and died of starvation. This they did all that day, going very slowly and warily, while Bombur kept on wailing that his legs would not carry him, and that he wanted to lie down and sleep. "No, you don't," they said. "Let your legs take their share. We have carried you far enough." All the same, he suddenly refused to go a step further and flung himself on the ground. "Go on if you must," he said. "I'm just going to lie here and sleep and dream of food. And if I can't get it any other way, I hope I never wake up again." At that very moment, Balin, who was a little way ahead, called out, "What was that? I thought I saw a twinkle of light in the forest." They all looked, and a longish way off it seemed that they saw a red twinkle in the dark. Then another, and another sprang out beside it. Even Bombur got up, and they hurried along then, not caring if it was trolls or goblins. The light was in front of them and to the left of the path, and when at last they had drawn level with it, it seemed plain that torches and fires were burning under the trees, but a good way off the track. "It looks as if my dreams are coming true," gasped Bombur, puffing up behind. He wanted to rush straight off into the wood after the lights, but the others remembered only too well the warnings of the wizard and of Beorn. "A feast would be no good if we never got back alive from it," said Thorin. "But without a feast we shan't remain alive much longer anyway," said Bombur, and Bilbo heartily agreed with him. They argued about it backwards and forwards for a long while, until they agreed at length to send out a couple of spies, to creep near the lights and find out more about them. But then they could not agree on who was to be sent. No one seemed anxious to run the chance of being lost and never finding his friends again. In the end, in spite of warnings, hunger decided them, because Bombur kept on describing all the good things that were being eaten, according to his dream, in the woodland feast. So they all left the path and plunged into the forest together. After a good deal of creeping and crawling, they peered round the trunks and looked into a clearing where some trees had been felled and the ground leveled. There were many people there, elvish-looking folk, all dressed in green and brown and sitting on sawn rings of the felled trees in a great circle. There was a fire in their midst, and there were torches fastened to some of the trees round about, but most splendid sight of all, they were eating and drinking and laughing merrily. The smell of the roast meats was so enchanting that, without waiting to consult one another, every one of them got up and scrambled forwards into the ring, with the idea of begging for some food. No sooner had the first stepped into the clearing than all the lights went out as if by magic. Somebody kicked the fire, and it went up in rockets of glittering sparks and vanished. They were lost in completely lightless dark, and they could not even find one another. Not for a long time, at any rate. After blundering frantically in the gloom, falling over logs, bumping, crashing into trees, and shouting and calling, till they must have waked everything in the forest for miles, at last they managed to gather themselves in a bundle and count themselves by touch. By that time they had, of course, quite forgotten in which direction the path lay, and they were all hopelessly lost, at least till morning. There was nothing for it but to settle down for the night where they were. They did not even dare to search on the grounds for scraps of food for fear of becoming separated again. But they had not long been lying, and Bilbo was only just getting drowsy when Dori, whose turn it was to watch first, said in a loud whisper, "The lights are coming out again over there. Out there are more than ever of them." Up they all jumped. There, sure enough, not far away, were scores of twinkling lights, and they heard the voices and the laughter quite plainly. They crept slowly towards them in single line, each touching the back of the one in front. When they got near, Thorin said, "No rushing forward this time. No one is to stir from hiding till I say. I shall send Mr. Baggins alone first to talk to them. They won't be frightened of him." "What about me of them?" thought Bilbo. "And anyway, I hope they won't do anything nasty to him." When they got to the edge of the circle of lights, they pushed Bilbo suddenly from behind. Before he had time to slip on his ring, he stumbled forward into the full blaze of the fire and torches. It was no good. Out went all the lights again, and complete darkness fell. If it had been difficult collecting themselves before, it was far worse this time. And they simply could not find the Hobbit. Every time they counted themselves, it only made 13. They shouted and called, "Bilbo Baggins, Hobbit, you dreaded Hobbit! Hi, Hobbit, come fusticate you, where are you?" And other things of that sort, but there was no answer. They were just giving up hope when Dori stumbled across him by sheer luck. In the dark he fell over what he thought was a log, and he found it was a hobbit curled up fast asleep. It took a deal of shaking to wake him, and when he was awake he was not pleased at all. "I was having such a lovely dream," he grumbled, "all about having the most gorgeous dinner." "Good heavens, he has gone like Bombur," they said. "Don't tell us about dreams. Dream dinners aren't any good, and we can't share them." "They're the best I'm likely to get in this beastly place," he muttered, and he lay down beside the dwarves and tried to go back to sleep and find his dream again. But that was not the last of the lights in the forest. Later, when the night must still have been getting old, Killy, who was watching them, came and roused them all again, saying, "There's a regular blaze of lights begun not far away. Hundreds of torches and many fires must have been lit, suddenly and by magic. And hark to the singing and the harps!" After lying and listening for a while, they found they could not resist the desire to go nearer and try once more to get help. Up they got again, and this time the result was disastrous. The feast that they now saw was greater and more magnificent than before, and at the head of a long line of feasters sat a woodland king with a crown of leaves upon his golden hair, very much as Bombur had described the figure in his dreams. The elvish folk were passing bowls from hand to hand and across the fires, and some were harping, and many were singing. Their gleaming hair was twined with flowers, green and white gems glinted on their collars and on their belts, and their faces and their songs were filled with mirth. Loud and clear and fair were those songs, and out stepped Thorin into their midst. I'm going to pause right here, partly because I need water, and partly because we need to talk about some of this stuff. So, one of the things that's mentioned is the character of the Elven King. His name is never actually mentioned in the book. He's only ever called the Elven King or the King. His name is Thranduil, and his name is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, which of course is the sequel. And even though he's not really a character in The Lord of the Rings, he's a character in The Hobbit. He's only mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, but his son, Legolas, is an important character in The Lord of the Rings. But what's interesting is that when the Peter Jackson films came out, around the early 2000s, there was a lot of discussion about Legolas specifically and the portrayal of Legolas by Orlando Bloom as having blonde hair. And there were a lot of people who said, actually he wasn't blonde in the books. And that's not actually correct. And there were other people still that said that in the book, The Lord of the Rings, Legolas's hair is never described as being any particular color, and that actually is correct. He's never described as being dark-haired or light-haired or anything. Of course, he has long hair, as all elves do have long hair, but the color is never described. And there has been a bit of an internet backlash against blonde Legolas for the past 20 years or so because of this. But here we see his father, Thranduil, is specifically described as having golden hair, which we would understand to be blonde. Now, we don't know that means that Legolas has blonde hair. Just because your father is blonde does not mean that you will be blonde. But it is an indicator that Legolas may have been blonde. And one of the biggest mysteries about Legolas, as he's a very mysterious character who's not very well fleshed out, is his mother. The Hobbit films, also made by Peter Jackson, basically gave a story about Legolas's mother that was not at all from the books, but it was sort of adapted from the story of Elrond's wife, Celebrian, except Celebrian did not die, but rather she was saved by her sons, Elrohir and Elladan, and she wound up being healed by her husband, Elrond, and then she sailed to the west, meaning that she left Middle-earth, and she went to the Undying Lands, and that he would join her later. So why do I bring that up? I bring that up because they basically took Celebrian's story and gave it a little bit more edge and adapted it for this mysterious character that is Legolas's mother. But in fact, Legolas's mother was never named. She's never been seen. We don't know if she had passed away and gone to the west that way, or if she had in fact sailed to the west, or if she's been there the whole time and is just, off camera, so to speak, just not an important enough character to be mentioned by name or to be mentioned at all. And so, of course, we also don't know what she looks like. So I'm of the opinion that I would say that it is likely that Legolas had blonde hair. It's not 100% certain, but it is likely because the only parent that we are privy to any sort of description of is Thranduil, and he is specifically said to be golden-haired. So that's the big thing I wanted to mention, was how Thranduil was described. Now, what's interesting is we had heard about the black stream that Bombur fell into, and we had heard about it before they even came into Mirkwood. Bjorn warned them that there is a stream that goes across the path and not to touch it or to drink from it or to even set foot in it, because you will go into an enchanted sleep. And it's never really described as to who put this enchantment on the stream. Certainly, we wouldn't say that it would be Sauron. It's a little too far to the north to be his influence. And the thing is that when Bombur is put to sleep by this enchanted water, he has this very specific dream. And then when Bilbo is put to sleep by elf magic, he has the same sort of dream. So that, to me, is an inference that the river is enchanted because Thranduil enchanted it, or his people enchanted, that it is elf magic. And we may say that this water may even be the border of his realm. Now, the one thing that is never explained, because the way that elves work in the Third Age stories is very, very mysterious and very strange, some would say. We get Legolas speaking to rocks. We get Legolas running across snow without making any footprints. And here we get this idea that the elves could set up these big parties in the middle of Mirkwood Forest with food and bowls and bonfires and torches and tables and harps even, and that in a split second it could all go poof and disappear and appear in a different part of the forest. And it's interesting to have that kind of security, and that each time they're partying and they get interrupted, it's a bigger feast when they get back to it. It's never really explained how the elves do this, other than it's magic. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well. Okay, where was I? Dead silence fell in the middle of a word. Out went all the light. The fires leaped up in black smokes. Ashes and cinders were in the eyes of the dwarves, and the wood was filled again with their clamor and their cries. Bilbo found himself running round and round as he thought, and calling, Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Filly, Killy, Bombur, Bifur, Bofur, Dwalin, Balin, Thorin Oakenshield, while people he could not see or feel were doing the same all around him, with an occasional Bilbo thrown in. But the cries of the others got steadily further and fainter. And though after a while it seemed to him that they changed to yells and cries for help in the far distance, all noise at last died right away, and he was left alone in complete silence and darkness. That was one of his most miserable moments, but he soon made up his mind that it was no good trying to do anything till day came with some little light, and quite useless to go blundering about tiring himself out with no hope of any breakfast to revive him. So he sat himself down with his back to a tree, and not for the last time fell to thinking of his far-distant hobbit hole with its beautiful pantries. He was deep in thought of bacon and eggs and toast and butter, when he felt something touch him. Something like a strong, sticky string was against his left hand, and when he tried to move, he found that his legs were already wrapped in the same stuff, so that when he got up, he fell over. Then the giant spider, who had been busy tying him up while he dozed, came from behind him and came at him. He could only see the thing's eyes, but he could feel its hairy legs as it struggled to wind its abominable threads round and round him. It was lucky that he had come to his senses in time. Soon he would not have been able to move at all. As it was, he had a desperate fight before he got free. He beat the creature off with his hands. It was trying to poison him to keep him quiet, as small spiders do to flies, until he remembered his sword and drew it out. Then the spider jumped back, and he had time to cut his legs loose. After that, it was his turn to attack. The spider evidently was not used to things that carried such stings at their side, or it would have hurried away quicker. Bilbo came at it before it could disappear and struck it with its sword right in the eyes. Then it went mad and leaped and danced and flung out its legs in horrible jerks until he killed it with another stroke, and then he fell down and remembered nothing more for a long while. There was the usual dim grey light of the forest day about him when he came to his senses. The spider lay dead beside him, and his sword blade was stained black. Somehow the killing of the giant spider, all alone by himself in the dark, without the help of the wizard or the dwarves or of anyone else, made a great difference to Mr. Baggins. He felt a different person, and much fiercer and bolder in spite of an empty stomach, as he wiped his sword on the grass and put it back into its sheath. "I will give you a name," he said to it, "and I shall call you Sting." After that he set out to explore. The forest was grim and silent, but obviously he had first of all to look for his friends, who were not likely to be far off, unless they had been made prisoners by the elves or worse things. Bilbo felt that it was unsafe to shout, and he had a long while wondering in what direction the path lay, and in what direction he should go first to look for the dwarves. "Oh, why did we not remember Beorn's advice and Gandalf's?" he lamented. "What a mess we're in now." We. I only wish it was we. It is a horrible thing being all alone. In the end, he made as good a guess as he could at the direction from which the cries for help had come in the night, and by luck, he was born with a good share of it, he guessed more or less right, as we will see. Having made up his mind, he crept along as cleverly as he could. Hobbits are clever at quietness, especially in woods, as I have already told you, and Bilbo had slipped on his ring before he started. That is why the spiders neither saw him nor heard him coming. He had picked his way steadily for some distance when he noticed a place of dense black shadow ahead of him, black even for that forest, like a patch of midnight that had never been cleared away. As he drew nearer, he saw that it was made by spider webs, one behind and over tangled with another. Suddenly he saw, too, that there were spiders, huge and horrible, sitting in the branches above him, and ring or no ring, He trembled with fear lest they should discover him. Standing behind a tree, he watched a group of them for some time, and then, in the silence and stillness of the wood, he realized that these loathsome creatures were speaking to one another. Their voices were a sort of thin creaking and hissing, but he could make out many of the words that they said. They were talking about the dwarves. It was a sharp struggle, but worth it, said one. What nasty thick skins they have, to be sure, but I'll wager there is good juice inside. Aye, they'll make fine eating when they've hung a bit, said another. Don't hang 'em too long, said a third. They're not as fat as they might be. Been feeding none too well of late, I should guess. Kill 'em, I say, hissed a fourth. Kill 'em now and hang 'em dead for a while. They're dead now, I'll warrant, said the first. That they are not. I saw one a-struggling just now, just coming round again, I should say, after a beautiful sleep. I'll show you. With that, one of the fat spiders ran along a rope until it came to a dozen bundles hanging in a row from a high branch. Bilbo was horrified, now that he noticed them for the first time dangling in the shadows, to see a dwarfish foot sticking out of the bottoms of some of the bundles, or here and there the tip of a nose, or a bit of beard, or of a hood. To the fattest of these bundles the spider went. It is poor old Bombur, I bet, thought Bilbo, and nipped hard at the nose that stuck out. There was a muffled yelp inside, and a toe shot up and kicked the spider straight and hard. There was life in Bombur still. There was a noise like a kicking of a flabby football, and the enraged spider fell on the branch, only catching itself with its own thread just in time. The others laughed. You are quite right, they said. The meat's alive and kicking. I'll soon put an end to that, hissed the angry spider, climbing back onto the branch. Bilbo saw the moment had come where he must do something. He could not get up at the brutes, and he had nothing to shoot with, but looking about, he saw that in this place there were many stones lying about in what appeared to be a now dry little watercourse. Bilbo was a pretty fair shot with a stone, and it did not take him long to find a nice, smooth, egg-shaped one that fitted his hand cozily. As a boy, he used to practice throwing stones at things, until rabbits and squirrels and even birds got out of his way, as quick as lightning if they saw him stoop. And even grown up, he had still spent quite a bit of his time at quoits, dart throwing, shooting at the wand, bowls, ninepins, and other quiet games of aiming and throwing sort. Indeed, he could do all lots of things besides blowing smoke rings, asking riddles, and cooking, that I haven't time to tell you about. There is no time now. While he was picking up stones, the spider had reached Bombur, and soon he would have been dead. At that moment, Bilbo threw. The stone struck the spider plunk on the head, and it dropped senseless off the tree, flopped to the ground with all its legs curled up. The next stone went whizzing through a big web, snapping its cords and taking the spider sitting in the middle of it, whack, dead. After that, there was a deal of commotion in the spider colony, and they forgot the dwarves for a bit, I can tell you. They could not see Bilbo, but they could make a good guess at the direction from which the stones were coming. As quick as lightning, they came running and swinging towards the hobbit, flinging out their long threads in all directions till the air seemed full of waving snares. Bilbo, however, soon slipped away to a different place. The idea came to him to lead the furious spiders further and further away from the dwarves if he could, to make them curious, excited, and angry all at once. When about 50 had gone off to the place where he had stood before, he threw some more stones at these, and at others that had stopped behind. Then, dancing among the trees, he began to sing a song to infuriate them, and to bring them all after him, and also to let the dwarves hear his voice. This is what he sang. Old fat spider spinning in a tree. Old fat spider can't see me. Attercop, won't you stop? Stop your spinning and look for me. Old Tom Noddy, old big body. Old Tom Noddy can't spy me. Attercop, down you drop. You'll never catch me up your tree. Not very good, perhaps. But then you must remember that he had to make it up himself on the spur of a very awkward moment. It did what he wanted anyway. As he sang, he threw some more stones and stamped. Practically all the spiders in the place came after him. Some dropped to the ground, others raced along the branches, swung from tree to tree, or cast new ropes across the dark spaces. They made for his noise far quicker than he had expected. They were frightfully angry. Quite apart from all the stones, no spider has ever liked being called Attercop, and Tom Noddy, of course, is insulting to anybody. Off Bilbo scuttled to a fresh place, but several of the spiders had run now to different points in the glade where they lived, and were busy spinning webs all across the spaces between tree stems. Very soon the hobbit would be caught in a thick fence of them all around him. And that, at least, was the spider's idea. Standing now in the middle of the hunting and spinning spiders, Bilbo plucked up his courage and began a new song. Lazy lob and crazy cob, as weaving webs to wind me. I'm far more sweet than other meat, but still they cannot find me. Here I am, naughty little fly, you are fat and lazy. You cannot trap me, though you try, in your cobwebs crazy. So I'm going to stop here for a moment, and we'll discuss this. So when I was reading this for the first time, as I mentioned earlier, I was a young boy of about 7 or 8 years old. And it was interesting that Bilbo uses these specific words. He says Addercop and Tom Noddy. And I had no idea what either of these things meant. And it says, it sort of tells you from context that, and from the narrative voice, that these are insults. And that no spider has ever been liked being called Addercop. So I remember I looked up Addercop, and it has 2 definitions. The first is actually a spider. So when he says Addercop, he's saying spider. But it also can mean a person of ill nature, somebody who's just like a jerk, you know. So that made sense. But then it says that Tom Noddy is not specifically to spiders, that it's offensive to anybody. Oh, wait a second here. Oh my God. So, of course, I had to find out what Tom Noddy meant and what it is. And I had a difficult time finding the definition of Tom Noddy. And the best that I could find was that it mostly refers to a specific type of fish. But that's not insulting enough to be what Tolkien is talking about when he says that the word Tom Noddy is offensive to anybody. But I found that you could refer to a fish, a puffer fish, as a Tom Noddy. You could refer to a bird, a parrot specifically, as a Tom Noddy. But there is a rather obscure slang meaning that it basically means stupid. That it's like saying idiot, you know. So, and I think that at this point, Tolkien was obviously, you know, he was sort of fresh off of writing for the Oxford English Dictionary, and he probably learned a lot of very obscure words while working there. I mean, his wheelhouse was the letter W, words that began with the letter W. He researched and wrote etymologies. Some of the etymologies that are still in the Oxford English Dictionary to this day were written by Tolkien in the W section. But Tom Noddy is interesting because it's sort of a very ancient way of calling somebody like a dunce. And the only modern English word that still derives from Tom Noddy is tomfoolery. You don't call somebody a tomfool or a Tom Noddy anymore, but you would say tomfoolery. Like, what is this tomfoolery? So that's sort of the interesting linguistic quirk, that the sort of thing that Tolkien is very much into. Okay, let's continue. With that, he turned and found that the last space between 2 tall trees had been closed with a web, but luckily not a proper web, only great strands of double-thick spider rope run hastily backwards and forwards from trunk to trunk. Out came his little sword. He slashed the threads to pieces and off went singing. The spiders saw the sword, though I don't suppose they knew what it was, and at once the whole lot of them came hurrying after the hobbit, along the ground and the branches, hairy legs waving, nippers and spinners snapping, eyes popping full of froth and rage. They followed him into the forest until Bilbo had gone as far as he dared. Then, quieter than a mouse, he stole back. He had precious little time, he knew, before the spiders were disgusted and came back to their trees where the dwarves were hung. In the meanwhile, he had to try to rescue them. The worst part of the job was getting up to the long branch where the bundles were dangling. I don't suppose he would have managed it if a spider had not luckily left a rope hanging down. With its help, though it stuck to his hand and hurt him, he scrambled up only to meet an old, slow, wicked, fat-bodied spider who had remained behind to guard the prisoners, and he had been busy pinching them to see which was the juiciest to eat. It had thought that starting the feast while the others were away, but Mr. Baggins was in a hurry, and before the spider knew what was happening, it felt his sting and rolled off the branch dead. Bilbo's next job was to loose a dwarf. What was he to do? If he cut the string which hung him up, the wretched dwarf would tumble thump to the ground a good way below, wriggling along the branch, which made all the poor dwarves dance and jiggle like ripe fruit. He reached the first bundle. Filly or Killy, he thought by the tip of a blue hood sticking out of the top. Most likely Filly, he thought by the tip of a long nose poking out of the winding threads. He managed by leaning over to cut most of the strong, sticky threads that bound him round, and then, sure enough, with a kick and a struggle, most of Filly emerged. I'm afraid Bilbo actually laughed at the sight of him jerking his stiff arms and legs as he danced in the spider string under his armpits, just like one of those funny toys bobbing on a wire. Somehow or other, Filly was got onto the branch, and then he did his best to help the Hobbit, though he was feeling very sick and ill from spider poison and from hanging most of the night, and the next day wound round and round with only his nose to breathe through. It took him ages to get the beastly stuff out of his eyes and eyebrows, and as for his beard, he had to cut most of it off. Well, between them, they started to haul up first one dwarf and then another and slash them free. None of them were better off than Filly, and some of them were worse. Some had hardly been able to breathe at all. Long noses were sometimes useful, you see, and some had been more poisoned. In this way, they rescued Killy, Bifur, Bofur, Dori, and Nori. Poor old Bombur was so exhausted, he was the fattest and had been constantly pinched and poked, that he just rolled off the branch and fell plop on the ground, fortunately onto leaves, and lay there. But there were still 5 dwarves hanging at the end of the branch when the spiders began to come back, more full of rage than ever. Bilbo immediately went to the end of the branch nearest the tree trunk, and kept back those that crawled up. He had taken off his ring when he had rescued Filly and forgot to put it on again. So now they all began to sputter and hiss. "Now we see you, you nasty little creature. We will eat you and leave your bones and skin hanging on a tree. Ugh, he's got a sting, has he? Well, we'll get him all the same, and then we'll hang him head downwards for a day or 2. While this was going on, the other dwarves were working at the rest of the captives and cutting all the threads with their knives. Soon all would be free, though it was not clear what would happen after that. The spiders had caught them pretty easily the night before, but that had been unawares and in the dark. This time there looked like being a horrible battle. Suddenly Bilbo noticed that some of the spiders had gathered round old Bombur on the floor, and had tied him up again and were dragging him away. He gave a shout and slashed at the spiders in front of him. They quickly gave way, and he scrambled and fell down the tree, right into the middle of those on the ground. His little sword was something new to the way of stings for them. How it darted to and fro! It shone with delight as he stabbed at them. 6 were killed before the rest drew off and left Bombur to Bilbo. Come down, he shouted to the dwarves on the branch. Don't stay up there and be netted." For he saw spiders swarming up the neighboring trees and crawling along the boughs above the heads of the dwarves. All right, I have to pause here, not to comment on anything, but I just need water. Like I've said, these sorts of streams are a little bit rougher on my voice than average, but that's okay. I do enjoy them. Let's see. Down the dwarves scrambled or jumped or dropped, 11 all in a heap, most of them very shaky and little use on their legs. There they were at last, 12 of them, counting poor old Bombur, who was being propped up on either side by his cousin Bifur and his brother Bofur. And Bilbo was dancing about and waving his sting, and hundreds of angry spiders were goggling at them all around and about and above. It looked pretty hopeless. Then the battle began. Some of the dwarves had knives, and some had sticks, and all of them could get at stones, and Bilbo had his elvish dagger. Again and again the spiders were beaten off, and many of them were killed. But it could not go on for long. Bilbo was nearly tired out. Only 4 of the dwarves were able to stand firmly, and soon they would all be overpowered like weary flies. Already the spiders were beginning to weave their webs all around them again from tree to tree. Oh, hey, Evie. Pros and cons. That's very clever. I like that. That's very, very clever. Pros and cons. I bet you that there would be writers who would set up something like that with cons. In the end, Bilbo could think of no plan except to let the dwarves into the secret of his ring. He was rather sorry about it, but could not be helped. I'm going to disappear, he said. I shall draw the spiders off if I can, and you must keep together and make it in the opposite direction. To the left there, that is more or less the way towards the place where we last saw the elf fires. It was difficult to get them to understand, what with their dizzy heads and the shouts and the whacking of sticks and the throwing of stones, but at last Bilbo felt he could delay no longer. The spiders were drawing their circle ever closer. He suddenly slipped on his ring, and to the great astonishment of the dwarves he vanished. Soon there came the sound of Lazy Lob and Addercop from among the trees away on the right. That upset the spiders greatly. They stopped advancing, and some went off in the direction of the voice. Addercop made them so angry that they lost their wits. Then Balin, who had grasped Bilbo's plan better than the rest, led an attack. The dwarves huddled together in a knot, and sending a shower of stones, they drove at the spiders on the left and burst through the ring. Away behind them now, the shouting and singing suddenly stopped. Hoping desperately that Bilbo had not been caught, the dwarves went on. Not fast enough, though. They were sick and weary, and they could not go on much better than a hobble and a wobble, though many of the spiders were close behind. Every now and then they had to turn and fight the creatures that were overtaking them. And already some spiders were in the trees above them and throwing down their long, clinging threads. Things were looking pretty bad again, when suddenly Bilbo reappeared and charged into the astonished spiders unexpectedly from the side. Go on, he shouted. I will do the stinging. And he did. He darted backwards and forwards, slashing at spider threads, hacking at their legs, and stabbing at their fat bodies if they came too near. The spiders swelled with rage and spluttered and frothed and hissed out horrible curses, but they had become mortally afraid of Sting and dared not come very near, now that it had come back. So curse as they would, their prey moved slowly but steadily away. It was a most terrible business and seemed to take hours, but at last, just when Bilbo felt that he could not lift his hand for a single stroke more, the spiders suddenly gave it up and followed them no more, but went back, disappointed, to their dark colony. The dwarves then noticed that they had come to the edge of a ring where all the elf fires had been. Whether it was one of them that they had seen the night before, they could not tell, but it seemed that some good magic lingered in such spots, which the spiders did not like. At any rate, here the light was greener, and the boughs less thick and threatening, and they had a chance to rest and draw breath. There they lay for some time, puffing and panting, but very soon they began to ask questions. They had to have the whole vanishing business carefully explained, and the finding of the ring interested them so much that for a while they forgot their own troubles. Balin in particular insisted on having the Gollum story, riddles and all, told all over again, with the ring in its proper place. But after a time the light began to fail, and then other questions were asked. Where were they? And where was their path? And where was there any food? And what were they going to do next? These questions they asked over and over again, and it was from the little that Bilbo that they seemed to expect to get the answers. But from which you can see that they had changed their opinion of Mr. Baggins very much. They had begun to have a great respect for him, as Gandalf said that they would. Indeed, they really expected him to think of some wonderful plan for helping them, and they were not merely grumbling. They knew only too well that they would all soon have been dead if it had not been for the Hobbit, and they thanked him many times. Some of them even got up and bowed right to the ground before him, though they fell over with the effort and could not get on their legs again for some time. Knowing the truth about the vanishing did not lessen their opinion of Bilbo at all, for they saw that he had some wits, as well as luck, and a magic ring, and all three are very useful possessions. In fact, they praised him so much that Bilbo began to feel there really was something of a bold adventurer about himself after all, though he would have felt a lot bolder still, if there had been anything to eat. But there was nothing at all, and none of them were fit to go back and look for anything or to search for the lost path. The lost path. No other idea could come into Bilbo's tired head. He just sat, staring in front of him at the endless trees, and after a while they all fell silent again. All except Balin. Long after the others had stopped talking and shut their eyes, he kept on muttering and chuckling to himself. Gollum, well, I'm blessed. So that's how he sneaked past me, is it? Now I know. Just crept along quietly along, did you, Mr. Baggins? Buttons all over the doorstep. Good old Bilbo. Bilbo. And then he fell asleep, and there was complete silence for a long while. All of a sudden Dwalin opened an eye and looked around at them. Where is Thorin? He asked. It was a terrible shock. Of course, there were only 13 of them, 12 dwarves and the Hobbit. Where indeed was Thorin? They wondered what evil fate had befallen him, magic or dark monsters, and shuddered as they lay lost in the forest. There they dropped off one by one into uncomfortable sleep full of horrible dreams, and evening wore to black night. and there we must leave them for the present, too sick and weary to set guards or take turns at watching. Thorin had been caught much faster than they had. You remember Bilbo falling like a log into sleep as he stepped into a circle of light? The next time it had been Thorin who stepped forward, and as the lights went out he felt like a stone enchanted. All the noise of the dwarves lost in the night, their cries as the spiders caught them and bound them, and all the sounds of the battle the next day had passed over him unheard, when the wood elves had come to him and bound him and carried him away. The feasting people were wood elves, of course. These are not wicked folk. If they have a fault, it is distrust of strangers, though their magic was strong, even in the days they were wary. They differed from the high elves of the West, and they were more dangerous and less wise, for most of them, together with their scattered relations in the hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that had never went to faerie in the West. There the light elves and the deep elves and the sea elves went and lived for ages and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and their cunning craft in the making of beautiful and marvelous things, before some came back into the wide world. In the wide world the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars, and they wandered in the great forests that grew tall in lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of the woods, from which they could escape at times to hunt or to ride and run over the open lands by moonlight or starlight. And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the gloaming and the dusk. Still elves they were and remain, and that is good people. Okay, let's pause here because there's a lot to talk about from that passage. So, keeping in mind that this is a story that Tolkien was originally telling to his children as a bedtime story. And, you know, he's telling this story to Christopher and to Michael and whatnot, and, you know, and Christopher is very discerning and keeping with continuity and details, and that's why it was all started to be written down, because Tolkien would be telling a story, and as all fathers do when they're telling an oral story to their children at bedtime, they would forget details or they would change things. And then little Christopher Tolkien would say, "And last time you told me that Bilbo's door was blue, and now you're saying it's green, so which is it?" And Tolkien would come out of the room and he would say, you know, "Drat the lad," you know, and he would start writing things down. And that's how The Hobbit became a written book. But it remained essentially a fairy tale that he wrote for his children. And it was not intended to be connected to anything else until later, when he started writing the sequel, which he was always going to call The Lord of the Rings. But The Lord of the Rings at this point was just simply the second book after The Hobbit. It was the Hobbit sequel. And it was very different in its initial writing. The reason that I point out this passage in particular, what I just read about the elves of the wood, is here you can see that even in this early stage, about 20 years before he wrote The Lord of the Rings, he was already connecting this work to the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is basically a collection of his mythology, and the earliest stories of it, the Children of Húrin, and the Fall of Gondolin, and Beren and Luthien, all predated The Hobbit. You know, they didn't get published till far later. They didn't get published until the Silmarillion came out and he had already passed on. Beren and Luthien was mentioned in The Lord of the Rings quite extensively. Gondolin was already mentioned here in The Hobbit as being where the swords came from, that Thorin has one of the swords and Gandalf has the other. And it's interesting, you know, that you might have been thinking in that scene where they're fighting the spiders that Bilbo is the only one with a sword. And it's mentioning that the dwarves all have sticks and stones and knives at the most. And you might thought, well, what about Thorin with his sword? And you think it might be an error that for a moment Tolkien forgot about it, but actually we see that Thorin wasn't even present in that scene. But anyway, that they mention Gondolin here. Beren and Luthien is very heavily referenced in the Lord of the Rings, especially in relation to Aragorn being like Beren and Arwen being like Luthien. And the Children of Húrin is the one that's like the furthest removed from these stories. It's very disconnected from it. The character from the Children of Húrin that gets mentioned in the Lord of the Rings the most is Morgoth, and even there it's just only once in a while he's alluded to. He's called the Great Enemy or the First Dark Lord. At one point, Gandalf does say the name Morgoth. Or I actually think it was Legolas that said it. But anyway, basically the plot of the Silmarillion is found right here. So I want to highlight a few passages here. They were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to Faerie in the West. Now, Faerie is a term that Tolkien uses to describe what he calls the Perilous Realm, which is a loose sort of umbrella term for these realms that are in all of his stories. But in this case, he's referring to the Undying Lands, where Valinor is, and where Eldamar is, and where Eressëa is. And we know this because he says it's in the West, but it's the West with a capital W. When, the Shire is in the West. Lindon is in the West at this point. And from where they are, the Misty Mountains are to the west. Rivendell's to the west. But these are lowercase w, west of where we are in Middle-earth. But Arda, the planet, to the west of the planet is where the Undying Lands are. That's where the Perilous Realm, Faerie, is. West with a capital W. Because you could sail, if you know what you're doing, if you're an elf or you're an angel and you know where the path is, you can sail straight off the planet and go to this realm. And it was alluded to earlier with Bilbo talking about Gandalf taking, at least in the early one version of the Hobbit, Gandalf taking hobbits to the west. That was later changed to other shores because it didn't make sense for hobbits to go to the west. But we know that they're talking about the Undying Lands because it's capital W. Then he mentions light elves, deep elves, and sea elves. And if we've read the Silmarillion, and I said going back to the Hobbit after reading the Silmarillion is quite a trip because you catch things like this. Light elves would be the Vanyar, the deep elves would be the Noldor, and the sea elves would be the Teleri, or more specifically the Falmari. And they lived for ages, and they grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and their cunning craft. And then some of them came back into the wide world. We would understand that some of them being the Noldor exiles who left the Undying Lands and came back to what he calls the wide world, but we need to understand it as being Middle-earth. And this is backed up in the Silmarillion when the elves are discussing the idea of going to Middle-earth. And Feanor had been unconscious, or I should say not unconsciously, but subconsciously manipulated by Melkor, who is Satan in Tolkien's work. And Melkor gave him this idea that the elves were robbed of their birthright of being kings of vast realms of Middle-earth, and that they're stuck in Aman, the continent, the main continent of the Undying Lands, which is described as being narrow. It is a narrow land, and Feanor uses this word again later, narrow. And that Middle-earth is vast, while Aman is narrow. And here we can see Bilbo in his storytelling referring to Middle-earth, which is never mentioned as being called Middle-earth in the story, but he refers to it as the wide world. Once again with capitals. Capital W's for west, wide, and world. W was the part of the dictionary that Tolkien worked on. That's probably coincidental, but fun to point out there. They, in the twilight of our sun and moon, because they came to Middle-earth when there was no sun and there was no moon. That Middle-earth was in darkness, but because of the destruction of the trees, the two trees of Valinor, by Morgoth, Melkor, and Ungoliant, the Valar created the sun and the moon. And that's why in The Lord of the Rings, Galadriel refers to beautiful and terrible as the dawn, because she saw the first sunrise. She didn't know what was going on. All of a sudden, the sky is on fire, So that's another little bit that's interesting here to point out there. And they wandered in the great forests and grew tall in lands that are now lost. This is referring to Beleriand, which was an area to the west of Eriador. The only bit of Beleriand that still exists is a place to the west of the Shire called Lindon, where the Grey Havens are. But there used to be a whole extra part of the continent there, Beleriand, and it's gone now. The War of Wrath, which was a 40-year war between Morgoth and the host of the Valar, destroyed it, and it cracked, and it sank into the sea, and it is gone. And we get a lot of references to it in The Lord of the Rings, not usually by name. They don't usually say Beleriand, but they say the lands that lie below the waves. Especially Treebeard mentions it, and Galadriel mentions it when speaking to Treebeard at the end of the story. But here we get this sole reference to Beleriand in The Hobbit, of all places, where he says, where was it again? Great forests that grew tall in lands that are now lost. And these great forests referring to places like Doriath. But let's continue. That's one of my favorite passages in The Hobbit, because there's a lot there that basically Quenta Silmarillion is laid out for you. The history of the elves in this little paragraph in The Hobbit. In a great cave some miles within the edge of Mirkwood, on its eastern side, there lived at this time their greatest king. Before his huge doors of stone, a river ran out of the heights of the forest, and flowed on and out into the marshes at the feet of the high wooded lands. This great cave, from which countless smaller ones opened out on every side, wound far underground, and had many passages and wide halls, but it was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, and neither so deep nor so dangerous. In fact, the subjects of this king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the ground and in the branches. The beeches were their favorite trees. The king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies. It was also the dungeon of his prisoners. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and they thought he was an enemy. In ancient days they had had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the Elf King had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. I have to stop here. This is another allusion to the Silmarillion. So the history of the relations between the elves and the dwarves is I would say, checkered. There was great times where they were great friends, like between Halin, also known as Oregion, and Khazad-dûm, also known as Moria, the former being a dwarfish kingdom. I'm sorry, the latter being a dwarfish kingdom, the former being an elvish settlement set up by Celebrimbor. And he specifically made Oregion, or Halin, if you prefer to call it that, to be in friendship with the dwarves. And then on the other side of things, there was war between dwarves and elves in the past. But notice that it said some of the dwarves. Not all of the dwarves, some of the dwarves. And I think in this story they are referring to the tale of the Nauglamir. So the Nauglamir was this bracelet that was of dwarvish make, and it was considered at the time to be the greatest craft ever made by a dwarf. And I mentioned Doriath, a vast forest kingdom in Beleriand, which was alluded to in the earlier line. And the king there was a guy named Ilu Thingol. And he was very, very tall. He was the tallest person to ever walk on Middle Earth, not counting, like the angels that could make themselves very large. That he was the tallest of all the children of Iluvatar, meaning he was the tallest of all the elves and the men. and his wife was an angel. He married Emelian, who was a Maiar spirit, and they had a daughter named Luthien, and this is a direct line that goes all the way down to Aragorn, which is not the point, but anyway, he had the idea, he was good friends with the dwarves for a time, and he had the idea that he could take the Nauglamir, which was a great dwarven craft, this fantastic bracelet that was given to him by the dwarves and was considered their greatest craft, and to take the Silmaril that had been brought to him by Beren, that Beren had went into Morgoth's fortress with Luthien, and they put Morgoth to sleep, and they pried a Silmaril off of his crown, and took it. And they didn't even get out of there with it, because the great werewolf Kacharoth came and bit his hand off and took the Silmaril with it, and there was a whole story behind that, and they had to hunt the wolf and cut its belly open and get the Silmaril. And the Silmarils were made by Feanor, the greatest of all the elven craftsmen. So he had the idea to, Iluthingol, I should say, had the idea to put this Silmaril onto the Nauglamir, thereby essentially marrying the greatest elvish craft and the greatest dwarvish craft in this symbolism of friendship that could have and should have cemented the elves and the dwarves as being friends from then on. And it went so south because the Silmaril was so beautiful and so fair and so enticing, much like the One Ring or the Palantiri, which were made by Feanor as well, and of course like the One Ring made by Sauron, both of them students of Aula who created the dwarves. It was so enticing to the dwarves that they wanted the Nauglamir itself as payment. And Thingol, of course, had every intention to actually pay the dwarves for their time, because he wanted them to set the Silmaril onto the Nauglamir, and he wanted to pay them for it. But if you think about it, let's say you have a ring and a diamond, and you go to a jeweler, and you say, I want you to take this diamond and put it on this ring. And the jeweler says, okay, I'll come back in a few days. And you come back in a few days, and the jeweler says to you, this ring is so pretty that I want this to be my payment. And you would say, that's ridiculous. No, I will give you money. I paid you to put the diamond on the ring so that I could have the diamond on the ring. What would be the point of paying you with the diamond ring? That doesn't make any sense, but that's what the dwarves asked for, because they were so enchanted by the Silmaril and the Nauglamir together. And it led to Thingol being murdered. It led to a lot of the dwarves being attacked. There was a war. Well, not really a war, but Beren led a host of Ents and attacked the dwarves and revenged the death of Thingol, and it led to the fall of Doriath. And this is why Doriath's kinsmen, guys like Orifer, who was Legolas's grandfather, and Celeborn, who was a cousin of some sort to Thingol, came to the east. They crossed over the Misty Mountains, and they wound up in places like Mirkwood and Lorien. And it's all because of how the relations came. And you can see that this is what Tolkien is alluding to here, right here in The Hobbit, that the elves are angry with some of the dwarves for specifically stealing from them. It doesn't mention murdering their king. It doesn't mention that part. But it says stealing their treasure, and that the dwarves are like, we were only taking what was due to us, our payment for working with their gold. So it's kind of interesting just to show in this chapter specifically, Flies and Spiders, how much of the Silmarillion is represented here in The Hobbit. Okay, let's continue. If the Elf King had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems. And though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as other elf lords of old. His people neither mined nor worked metals or jewels, nor did they bother much with trade or with tilling the earth. All of this was well known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had had nothing to do with the old quarrel I have spoken of. Consequently, Thorin was angry at their treatment of him, and when they took their spell off him, and he came to his senses, and also he was determined that no word of gold or jewels should be dragged out of him. The king looked sternly on Thorin when he had been brought before them, and asked him many questions. But Thorin would only say that he was starving. "Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking?" asked the king. "We did not attack them," asked Thorin. "We came to beg, because we were starving." "Where are your friends now, and what are they doing?" "I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest." "What were you doing in the forest?" "Looking for food and drink, because we were starving." "But what brought you into the forest at all?" asked the king angrily. At that Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. "Very well," said the king. "Take him away and keep him safe till he feels inclined to tell the truth, even if he waits 100 years. Then the elves put thongs on him and shut him in one of the inmost caves, with strong wooden dwarves, and left him. They gave him food and drink, plenty of both, if not very fine, for wood elves were not goblins, and they were reasonably well behaved, even to their worst enemies, when they captured them. The giant spiders were the only living things that they had no mercy upon. There in the king's dungeon poor Thorin lay, and after he had got over his thankfulness for bread and meat and water, he began to wonder what had become of his unfortunate friends. It was not very long before he discovered, but that belongs to the next chapter and the beginning of another adventure in which the Hobbit again showed his usefulness. All right, so before we get to the next chapter, just to comment on what a fool Thorin is. He gets it in his head that he's not going to mention any sort of treasure to Thranduil, the king, because he's afraid that if he mentions what his task actually is, what his raison d'etre is, that the king is going to offer him help, and therefore be entitled to some of the treasure, which Thorin is not wanting to share. And we notice that, like, the further along we get, the greedier Thorin gets. He gets greedier as he gets closer to the mountain. But what's really interesting here is that Thranduil basically asks him a simple question: "What are you doing here? What are you doing? Why are you passing through the forest?" And he could have easily have said that he was trying to get to Esgaroth, which is not exactly a lie, because that is the next step along the way. Or even he could have lied a little bit and said that he's going to the Iron Hills to see his cousin Dane Ironfoot, who is a character that we'll meet later on. But he doesn't say any of that. He just clams up and gets stuck into the dungeon. All right, so chapter 9 here, Barrels Out of Bond. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to try to find a way before they died of hunger and thirst. They got up and staggered on in the direction which 8 out of the 13 of them guessed to be the one in which the path lay, but they never found out if they were right. Such a day as there ever was in the forest was fading once more into the blackness of night, when suddenly out sprang the light of many torches all around them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leaped wood elves with their bows and spears and called the dwarves to a halt. There was no thought of a fight. Even if the dwarves had not been in such a state, they were actually glad to be captured. Their small knives, the only weapons they had, would have been of no use against the arrows of the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why, when the elves bound the dwarves in a long line, one behind the other, and counted them, they never found or counted the Hobbit. Nor did they hear or feel him trotting along well behind their torchlight as they led off their prisoners into the forest. Each dwarf was blindfolded, but that did not make much difference, for even Bilbo, with the use of his eyes, could not see where they were going, and neither could he or the others know where they had started from anyway. Bilbo had all he could do to keep up with the torches, for the elves were making the dwarves go as fast as they ever could, sick and weary as they were. The king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly the torches stopped, and the Hobbit had just time to catch them before they began to cross the bridge. This was the bridge that led across the river into the king's doors. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and at the far end were gates before the mouth of a huge cave that ran into the side of a steep slope covered with trees. There the great beaches came right down into the bank till their feet were in the stream. Across the bridge the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and he had only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over to the heels of the last elves before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a clang. Inside the passages were lit with red torchlight, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisted, crossing and echoing paths. They were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with cleaner air. In the great hall, with pillars hewn out of the living stone, sat the Elvenking on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand he held a carven staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes in here, he said. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who were once brought inside. Long and searchingly he questioned the dwarves about their doings, and where they were going to, and what they were coming from. But he got little more news out of them than out of Thorin. They were surly and angry, and did not even pretend to be polite. So just to pause here, just to show the illustration here of the Elvenking's Gate, and this is an illustration from Tolkien himself. So I'm going to go over to this screen here so we can show it. You can see here, that's the Elvenking's Gate drawing by J.R.R. Tolkien. Let's come back over here. No, it's upside down. What have we done, O king? Said Balin, who was the eldest left. Is it a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pet if killing them makes you angry? Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest, and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right to know what brings you here. And if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all prison until you have learned sense and manners. Then he ordered the dwarves each to be put in a separate cell and to be given food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prisons until one of them at least was willing to tell him all he wanted to know. But he did not tell them that Thorin was also a prisoner with them. It was Bilbo who found that out. Poor Mr. Baggins. It was a weary long time that he lived in that palace all alone, and always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remotest corners he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elvenking's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of the wood elves, sometimes with the king at their head, would from time to time ride out to hunt, or to other business in the woods and the lands to the east. Then, if Bilbo was very nimble, he could slip out just behind them, though it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once he was nearly caught in the doors as they clashed together when the last elf passed, yet he did not dare to march along them because of his shadow, altogether thin and wobbly as it was in the torchlight, or for fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good. He did not wish to desert the dwarves, and indeed he did not know where in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time they were out, so he never discovered the ways out of the wood, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself, until a chance came of returning. He was hungry, too, outside, for he was no hunter, but inside the caves he could pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from store or table when no one was at hand. I'm like a burglar that can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day, he thought. This is the dreariest and dullest part in all this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole by my warm fireside with a lamp shining. He often wished, too, that he could get a message for help sent to the wizard, but that, of course, was quite impossible, and he soon realized that if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins alone and unaided. Eventually, after a week or two of this sneaking sort of life, by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all of their 12 cells in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way around very well. What was his surprise one day to overhear one of the guards talking, and to learn that there was another dwarf in prison too, in a specially deep, dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that it was Thorin, and after a while he found his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find the place when no one was about, and to have a word with the chief of the dwarves. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and was even beginning to think of telling the king all about his treasure and his quest, which shows how low-spirited he had become, when he heard Bilbo's little voice at his keyhole. He could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and he had come to the door and heard a loud, long, whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message to each of the other imprisoned dwarves, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also in prison, close at hand, and that no one was to reveal their errand to the king, not yet, nor before Thorin gave the word. For Thorin had taken heart, again hearing how a hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of a share in the treasure, until all hope of escaping in any way had disappeared. Until, in fact, the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of whom he had begun to have a very high opinion indeed, had altogether failed to think of something clever. The other dwarves quite agreed when they got the message. They all thought their own shares of the treasure, which they quite regarded as theirs in spite of their plight and still unconquered dragon, would suffer seriously if the Wood Elves claimed part of it. And they all trusted Bilbo. Just what Gandalf had said would happen, you see. Perhaps that was part of the reason for going off and leaving them. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly so helpful as they did. He did not like being depended on by everyone, and he wished that he had the wizard at hand. But that was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood lay between them. He sat and thought until his head nearly burst, but no bright idea would come. One invisible ring was a very fine thing, but it was not much good among 14. But of course, as you have guessed, he did rescue his friends in the end, and this is how it happened. One day, nosing and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed under part of the lowest regions of the palace, and joined the forest river some way further to the east, beyond the steep slope out of which the main mouth opened. Where this underground watercourse came from, the hillside, there was a water gate. There the rocky roof came down close to the surface of the stream, and from it a portcullis could be dropped right onto the bed of the river to prevent anyone from coming or going out that way. But the portcullis was often open, and a good deal of traffic went out and in by the water gate. If anyone had come in that way, he would have found himself in a dark, rough tunnel, leading deep into the heart of the hill. But at one point it passed under the caves, and the roof had been cut away and covered with great oaken trap-doors. These opened upwards into the king's cellars. There stood barrels and barrels and barrels, for the Wood Elves, and especially their king, were very fond of wine, though no vines grew in these parts. The wine and other goods were brought from far away, from their kinsfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in distant lands. So to pause here, this is really interesting. Kinsfolk to the south has to be the elves of Lothlorien. That has to be Galadriel and Celeborn's people, because those are the only elves to be found to the south of Mirkwood. The elves don't really settle very much in the southern part of Middle-earth. They, or I should say the southern part of the section of Middle-earth that we are familiar with. So that being said, the southernmost elvish settlement is Lothlorien, and that's certainly what they're talking about, where the wine comes from, and it comes from men as well. Okay, did I lose my spot? I think I did. Oh, here we are. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered the trapdoors in their use, and lurking there listened to the talk of the king's servants. He learned how the wine and other goods came up the rivers or over land to the long lake. It seemed a town of men still throve there, built out on bridges far into the water as a protection against enemies of all sorts, and especially against the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought up the forest river. Often they were just tied together like big rafts and pooled or rowed up the stream. Sometimes they were loaded onto flat boats. When the barrels were empty, the elves cast them through the trapdoors, opened the water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bobbing along until they were carried by the current to a place far down the river, where the bank jutted out, near to the very east of Mirkwood. There they were collected and tied together and floated back to Lake Town, which stood close to the point where the forest river flowed into the long lake. For some time Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate, and wondered if it could be used for the escape of his friends, and at last he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had been taken to the prisoners. The guards were tramping away down the passages, taking the torchlight with them and leaving everything in darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief of the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be hard at work tonight clearing the cellars of the empty wood, so let us have a drink first to help the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. "I'll taste with you and see if it is fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and it would not do to send up poor stuff." When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered into a small cellar, and sat down on a table which 2 large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be potent wine to make a wood elf drowsy, but this wine, it would seem, was the heady vintage of the great gardens of Dorwinion, not meant for his soldiers or his servants, but for the king's feasts only, and for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon the chief guard nodded his head, and he laid it upon the table and fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while, without seeming to notice, but soon his head, too, nodded unto the table, and he fell asleep, snored beside his friend. Then in crept the Hobbit. Very soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passage towards the cells. The great bunch seemed very heavy to his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth, in spite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making every now and then a loud clink and clank, which put him all in a tremble. First he unlocked Balin's door, and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad he was apt to get out of this wearisome little stone room. He wanted to stop and ask questions, now that Bilbo was going to do, and all about it. "No time now," said the Hobbit. "You just follow me. We must all keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape or none, and this is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next, with chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue, there's a good fellow." Then off he went from door to door until his following had grown to 12. None of them any too nimble, what with the dark and with their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every time one of them bumped into another, or grunted, or whispered in the dark. "Drat this dwarfish racket," he said to himself. But all went well, and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night, and in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were merrymaking. Just one moment, I need water. Oh. So I guess they did mention Dorwinion, which is, it's more to the east than the south. But I guess normally they get their wine from the south, but this is special stuff. Okay. At last, after much blundering, they came to Thorin's dungeon far down in the deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellars. "Upon my word," said Thorin when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends. Gandalf spoke true as usual. "A pretty fine burglar you make it seems when the time comes. I'm sure we're all ever at your service, whatever happens after this, but what comes next?" Bilbo saw that the time had come to explain his idea as far as he could, but he did not feel at all sure how the dwarves would take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit, and started grumbling loudly in spite of their danger. "We shall be bruised and battered to pieces, and drowned too for certain," they muttered. "We thought you had some sensible notion when you managed to get hold of the keys. This is a mad idea." "Very well," said Bilbo, very downcast, and also rather annoyed. "Come along back to your nice cells, and I will lock you all in again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I shall ever get a hold of the keys again, even if I feel inclined to try." That was too much for them, and they calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to do just what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find their way into the upper halls, or to fight their way out of the gates that closed by magic, and it was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So following the Hobbit, down into the lowest cellars they crept. They passed a door through which the chief guard and the butler could be seen still happily snoring with smiles upon their faces. The wine of Dorwinion brings sleep and peaceful dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard next day, even though Bilbo, before they went on, stole in and kind-heartedly put the keys back on his belt. "That will save him some of the trouble he's in for," said Mr. Baggins to himself. "He wasn't a bad fellow, and quite decent to his prisoners. It will puzzle them all, too. They will think we had a very strong magic to pass through all those locked doors and disappear. Disappear? We've got to get busy very quick, if that is to happen." Balin was told off to watch the guard and the butler and give warning if they stirred. The rest went into the adjoining cellar with the trapdoors. There was little time to lose. Before long, as Bilbo knew, some elves were under orders to come down and help the butler get the empty barrels through the doors in the stream. They were in fact already standing in rows in the middle of the floor waiting to be pushed off. Some of them were wine barrels, and these were not much use as they could not easily be opened at the end without great deal of noise. Nor could they easily be secured again. But among them were several others which had been used for bringing in other stuffs, butter, apples, and all sorts of things to the king's palace. They soon found 13 with room enough for a dwarf in each. In fact, some were too roomy, and as they climbed in, the dwarves thought anxiously of the shaking and bumping they would get inside, though Bilbo did his best to find straw and other stuff to pack them in as cozily as could be managed in a short time. At last 12 dwarves were stowed. Thorin had given a lot of trouble, and turned and twisted in his tub, and grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel, while Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about air holes, and said he was stifling even before the lid was on. Bilbo had done what he could to close holes in the sides of the barrels, and to fix on all the lids safely as he could be managed. And now he was left alone again, running around, putting the finishing touches on the packing, and hoping against hope that his plan would come off. It had not been done a bit too soon. Only a minute or two after Balin's lid had been fitted on, there came the sound of voices and the flicker of lights. A number of elves came laughing and talking into the cellars and singing snatches of song. They had left a merry feast in one of the halls, and were bent on returning as soon as they could. "Where's old Gallion, the butler?" said one. "I haven't seen him at the tables tonight. He ought to be here now to show us what is to be done." "I should be angry if the old slow coach is late," said another. "I have no wish to waste time down here while the song is up." "Ha ha!" came a cry. "Here's the old villain with his head in a jug. He's been having a little feast all to himself and his friend the captain." So just to pause here, it's interesting that they mention the captain of the guard here. I'm sorry, not the captain of the guard, the butler. The king's butler, Gallion, is given a name, but the king himself, Thranduil's name, is never mentioned in the text. There's only 2 elves in The Hobbit that are named, and it's Gallion and Elrond. Elrond, of course, is this incredibly important character, and Gallion is a nobody. But, yeah, they never mention the king's name, but they mention Gallion's name. It's kind of funny. "Shake him, wake him," shouted the others impatiently. Gallion was not at all pleased at being shaken or wakened, and still less at being laughed at. "You're all late," he grumbled. "Here I am waiting and waiting down here while you fellows drink and make merry and forget your tasks. Small wonder if I fall asleep from weariness." "Small wonder," said they, "when the explanation stands close at hand in a jug. Come give us a taste of your sleeping draught before we fall, too. No need to wake the turnkey yonder. He's had his share by the looks of it." Then they drank one round and became mighty merry all of a sudden. But they did not quite lose their wits. "Save us, Gallion," cried some. "You began your feasting early and muddled your wits. You've stacked some full casks here instead of the empty ones, if there's anything in wait." "Get on with the work," growled the butler. "There was nothing in the feeling of weight in an idle tosspot's arms. These are the ones to go and no others. Do as I say." Very well, they answered, rolling the barrels to the opening. "On your head be it if the king's full butter tubs and his best wine is pushed into the river to the Lake Town men to feast for nothing. Roll, 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 rolling down the hole, heave, ho, splash, pump, down they go, down they bump." So they sang as one barrel and then another rumbled into the dark opening and was pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Some barrels really were empty, and some were tubs neatly packed with a dwarf each, but down they all went, one after another, with many a clash and a bump, thudding on top of the ones below, smacking into the water, jostling against the walls of the tunnel, knocking into one another, and bobbing away down the current. It was just at this moment that Bilbo suddenly discovered the weak point in his plan. Most likely you saw it some time ago and have been laughing at him, but I don't suppose you would have done half as well yourselves in his place. Of course, he was not in a barrel himself, nor was there anyone to pack him in even if there had been a chance. It looked as if he would certainly lose his friends this time. Nearly all of them had already disappeared through the dark trap door, and get utterly left behind, having to stay lurking as a permanent burglar in the elf caves forever. For even if he could have escaped through the upper gates at once, he had precious small chance of ever finding the dwarves again. He did not know the way by land to the place where the barrels were collected. He wondered what on earth would happen to them without him, for he had not the time to tell the dwarves all that he had learned, or what he had meant to do once they were out of the wood. While all these thoughts were passing through his mind, the elves began being very merry to sing another song round the river door. Some had already gone to haul on the ropes which pulled up the portcullis, at the water gate so as to let out the barrels as soon as they were all afloat below. Down the swift, dark stream you go, back to the lands you once did know. Leave the halls and caverns deep, leave the northern mountains steep, where the forest wide and dim stoops in shadows gray and grim. Float beyond the world of trees, out into the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes' waving weeds. Through the mist that riseth white, up from mere and pool at night, follow, follow, stars that leap up the heavens cold and steep. Turn when down comes over land, over rapid, over sand. South away and south away, seek the sunlight and the day. Back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and oxen feed. Back to gardens on the hills, where the berry swells and fills. Under sunlight, under day, south away and south away. Down the swift, dark streams you go, back to lands you once did know. Now the very last barrel was being rolled to the dwarves. In despair and not knowing what else to do, poor little Bilbo caught hold of it and was pushed over the edge with it. Down into the water he fell, splash into the cold, dark water with the barrel on top of him. He came up again sputtering and clinging to the wood like a rat. But for all his efforts he could not scramble on top. Every time he tried, the barrel rolled round and ducked him under again. It was really empty, and floated light as a cork. Though his ears were full of water, he could hear the elves still singing in the cellar above. Then suddenly the trapdoors fell, too, with a boom, and their voices faded away. He was in the dark tunnel, floating in icy water all alone, for you cannot count friends that are all packed up in barrels. Very soon a grey patch came in the darkness ahead. He heard the creak of the water gate being hauled up, and he found that he was in the midst of a bobbing and bumping mass of casks and tubs, all pressing together to pass under the arch and get out into the open stream. He had as much as he could do to prevent himself from being bustled and battered to bits, but at last the jostling crowd began to break up and swing off, one by another, under the stony arch and away. Then he saw that it would have been no good even if he had managed to get astride his barrel, for there was no room to spare, not even for a hobbit, between its top and the suddenly stooping roof where the gate was. Out they went into the overhanging branches of the trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered whether the dwarves were feeling and whether a lot of water was getting into their tubs. Some of those that bobbed along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed that these had dwarves inside. I do hope I put the lids on tight enough, he thought, but before long he was worrying too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head above the water, but he was shivering with the cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before his luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim the bank. Okay. Have to take a bit of a breather here. Well, I talked already about Galleon. I feel like there was something else that I wanted to mention. But, I suppose not. I really just need to drink some water here and take a little bit of a breather. We got about another hour left, so I think we can get to the point where we could finish this next month. And of course, after we finish The Hobbit, we will continue reading streams once per month on Thursday nights, but we will do The Lord of the Rings. But, yeah, I think we could probably get through A Warm Welcome. And then, yeah, the rest of it would be for the next stream, I think. The luck turned out all right before long. The eddying current carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and there for a while they stuck against some hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of his barrel while it was held steady against another. Up he crawled like a drowned rat and laid on the top, spread out to keep the balance as best he could. The breeze was cold, better than the water, and he hoped he would not suddenly roll off again when they started off once more. Before long the barrels broke free, and turned and twisted off down the stream, and out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared. But he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and being rather leaky had now shipped a small amount of water. All the same, it was like trying to ride, without bridle or stirrups, a round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling on the grass. In this way, at last, Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees on either side grew thinner. He could see the paler sky between them. The dark river opened suddenly wide, and there it was joined to the main water of the forest river, flowing down in haste from the king's great doors. There was a dim sheet of water no longer overshadowed, and on its sliding surface there were dancing and broken reflections of clouds and of stars. Then the hurrying water of the forest river swept up all the company of casks and tubs away to the north bank, in which it had been eaten out a wide bay. This had a shingly shore under hanging banks, and was walled at the eastern end by a little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore most of the barrels ran aground, though a few went on to bump against the stony pier. There were people on the lookout on the banks. They quickly poled and pushed all the barrels together into the shallows, and they had counted them, they roped them together, and left them till the morning. Poor dwarves. Bilbo was not badly off now. He slipped from his barrel and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to some huts that he could see near the water's edge. He no longer thought twice about picking up a supper uninvited if he got the chance. He had been obliged to do it for so long that he knew only too well what it was like to be really hungry, not merely politely interested in the dainties of a well-filled larder. Also, he had caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees, and that appealed to him with his dripping and ragged clothes clinging to him cold and clammy. Okay, so to pause here, an interesting thing is that I'm pretty sure at this stage in the story, at this exact day, is actually Bilbo's birthday. That he's turning 51, and of course it's not really on his mind that he's turning 51, that he's got other things in his mind, but I believe it's mentioned in The Lord of the Rings that this was Bilbo's birthday, and that he mentioned at his birthday party, at his 111th birthday party, or as he calls it, 111st birthday party, he mentioned that when he turned 51, he was riding a barrel, and that he had gotten a terrible cold from the ordeal. There was no need to tell you much of his adventures that night, for now we are drawing near to the end of the eastward journey, and coming to the last and greatest adventure, so we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the trail of drippings that he had left wherever he went or sat, and he also began to snivel, and wherever he tried to hide, he was found out by the terrific explosions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon there was a fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine, and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass wet as he was and far from a fire, but the bottle helped him do that, and he actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, though when the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke again with an especially loud sneeze. It was already grey morning, and there was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up a raft of barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the stream to Lake Town. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over. He scrambled down as fast as his stiff legs would take him, and managed just in time to get on the mass of casks without being noticed in the general bustle. Luckily, there was no sun at the time to cast an awkward shadow, and for a mercy he did not sneeze again for a good while. There was a mighty pushing of poles. The elves that were standing in the shallow water heaved and shoved. The barrels now all lashed together creaked and fretted. "This is a heavy load," some grumbled. "They float too deep, some of these, and never empty. If they had come ashore in the daylight, we might have had a look inside," they said. "No time now," said the raftmen. "Shove off." And off they went at last, slowly at first, until they had passed the point of the rock where the other elves stood to fend them off with poles. And then quicker and quicker they caught the main stream and went sailing away, down, down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king, and were through the woods, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen. So this brings us to chapter 10, which is called A Warm Welcome. And I think we have time for that, and perhaps the chapter after it, which is called On the Doorstep, and that's because that's rather a shorter chapter. So I think we could get through chapter 10 and 11. We'll see how it goes. The day grew brighter and warmer as they floated along. After a while, the river rounded a steep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an inland cliff, the deepest stream that flowed, lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away. The shores sank. The trees ended. Then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes and pools dotted with isles on every side. But still a strong water flowed unsteadily through the midst, and far away its dark head in torn cloud there loomed the mountain. Its nearest neighbors to the northeast, and the tumbled land that joined it to them, could not be seen. All alone it rose and looked across the marshes to the forest, the lonely mountain. Bilbo had come far and through many adventures to see it, and now he did not like the look of it in the least. As he listened to the talk of the raftsmen and pierced together the scraps of information they let fall, he soon realized that he was very fortunate ever to have seen it at all, even from this distance. Dreary as had been his imprisonment, and unpleasant as was his position, to say nothing of the poor dwarves underneath him, still he had been more lucky than he had guessed. The talk was all of the trade that came and went in the waterways, and the growth of the traffic on the river, and the roads out of the east towards Mirkwood vanished or fell into disuse, and of the bickerings of the lakemen and the wood elves about the upkeep of the forest river and the care of the banks. These lands had changed much since the days when the dwarves dwelt in the mountain, days which most people now remembered only as a very shadowy tradition. They had changed even in recent years, and since the last news that Gandalf had heard of them. Great floods and rains had swollen the waters that flowed east, and there had been an earthquake or two, which some were inclined to attribute to the dragon, alluding to him chiefly with a curse and an ominous nod in the direction of the mountain. The marshes and bogs that had spread wider and wider on either side. Paths had vanished, and many a rider and wanderer, too, if they had tried to find the lost ways across. The elf road, through which the wood which the dwarves had followed on the advice of Beorn, now came to a doubtful and little-used end at the eastern edge of the forest. Only the river offered any longer a safe way from the skirts of Mirkwood to the north, to the mountain-shadowed plains beyond, and the rivers that was guarded the wood elves' king. So you see, Bilbo had come in the end by the only road that was any good. It might have been some comfort to Mr. Baggins shivering on the barrels if he had known that news of this had reached Gandalf far away, and given him great anxiety, and that he was in fact finishing his other business, which does not come into this tale, and getting ready to come in search of Thorin's company, but Bilbo did not know it. Okay, stopping here, just to a few things. First of all, there's an illustration to show off, so we're going to go over to here, so we could show J.R.R. Tolkien's drawing of Esgaroth, also known as Lake Town. I'll try to hold that as steady as I can there. And also, just the thought that the news of the secret road being washed out in the end there. Hi, Just Tried Tomorrow. How's it going? Having reached Gandalf, and that he's worried about, about Bilbo and whatnot. But what's interesting here, and I just have to take this opportunity to bag on the Hobbit film trilogy just a little bit. I don't like to do that too much because it's a little too easy. But it's mentioned that Gandalf's task does not come into this tale, and yet they took this tiny book and they made it into 3 long movies, and part of the thing that added to it that made it into 3 films was following Gandalf and all these other characters such as Galadriel and Celeborn and Elrond and Radagast. Some reason Círdan got left out of it, as he usually does, and making what was really not part of the Hobbit part of the Hobbit. So that's just sort of interesting to point out. All he knew was that the river seemed to go on and forever, and he was hungry, and had a nasty cold in the nose, and did not like the way the mountain seemed to frown at him and threaten him as it drew ever nearer. After a while, however, the river took a more southerly course, and the mountains receded again, and at last, late in the day, the shores grew rocky. The river gathered all its wandering waters together into a deep and rapid flood, and they swept along at great speed. The sun had set, when turning in with another sweeping towards the east, the forest river rushed into the long lake. There it had a wide mouth with stony cliff-like gates at either side, whose feet were piled with shingles. The long lake! Bilbo had never imagined that any water that was not the sea could look so big. It was so wide that the opposite shores looked small and far, but it was so long that its northerly end, which pointed towards the mountain, could not be seen at all. Only from the map did Bilbo know that away up there, where the stars of the Wain were already twinkling, the running river came down into the lake from Dale, and with the forest river filled the deep waters that must have once been a great deep rocky valley. At the southern end, the doubled waters poured out again over high waterfalls and ran away hurriedly to unknown lands. In the stiff evening air, the noise of the falls could be heard like a distant roar. So to pause here for a moment, just to point out one little thing about the comment here about the Wain. just to put that into context here, I'm going to read that sentence again about the wain that he mentioned. Where is that? The stars of the wain were already twinkling. So usually when you hear the term wain, W-A-I-N, it's referring to some sort of carriage. Oh, this mentions the stars of the wain, and the wain is what we would call the Big Dipper. But what the elves called the Valakirka, or sickle of the Valar. And the dwarves had another name for it. They called it Durin's crown, and men called it the wain. And it's 7 stars, and the whole idea of 7 stars is very, very important in Tolkien's mythology. You see it crop up time and time again through Numenor, through the 7 houses of the dwarves, through Gondor, and you just see that symbology everywhere. Even Tur coming to the ocean, the first man to ever reach the ocean, followed 7 swans, and just the number 7 and the significance of the 7 stars, the sickle of the Valar. Very, very interesting and important there. Okay. Not far from the mouth of the forest river was the strange town he heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out into the surface of the lake, protected from the swirl of the entering river by a promontory of rock which formed a calm bay. A great bridge made of wood ran out to where on huge piles made of forest trees was built a busy wooden town. Not a town of elves, but of men, who still dared dwell here under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. They still throve when the trade that came up from the great river from the south and was carted past the falls to their town. But in the great days of old, when Dale in the north was rich and prosperous, they had been wealthy and powerful. And there had been fleets of boats on the waters, and some were filled with gold, and some with warriors and armor, and there had been wars and deeds, which were now only a legend. The rotting piles of a greater town could still be seen along the shores where the river waters sank in a drought. But men remembered little of all that, though some still sang old songs of the dwarf kings of the mountains, Thror and Thrain, on the race of Durin, and the coming of the dragon, and the fall of the lords of Dale. Some sang, too, that Thror and Thrain would come back one day, and gold would flow in rivers, through the mountain gates, and all that land would be filled with new song and new laughter. But this pleasant legend did not much affect their daily business. Of course, Thror and Thrain are not coming back. They are very, very dead. Thror was killed in Moria by a particularly nasty orc, or goblin, as you might say, called Azog. And Azog decapitated Thror and carved his name in runes onto Thror's head and threw it out towards his companion. And that was the end of Thorin's grandfather. Eventually, his son, Thrain II, revenged Azog and killed him in a battle called the Battle of Anuzulbar, which was right outside of Moria, and that's where he killed Azog. And which is interesting that Azog became such an important figure in the Peter Jackson films based on The Hobbit, because he was not in The Hobbit. He died a long time before The Hobbit. But Thrain had died more recently, as we learned in the beginning of The Hobbit, that he was in the Necromancer's dungeons. Exactly. How did he end up there is interesting. It's never actually explained, Tomorrow, how he got captured. But the hint here is that he was carrying one of the Rings of Power, and that Sauron at this point, the Necromancer, is collecting them for an unknown purpose, for he believes at this point that his ring, the ruling ring, the One Ring, is gone. Either gone forever or destroyed by the elves long ago. And he doesn't know that the One Ring is out there until he meets Gollum, and that's later. And I spoke about this on Quora not too long ago, about Thrain specifically, and it's going to be discussed in my next video next Wednesday when that's published, although if you're a member on my YouTube channel, you could already see it. That why was Sauron collecting the rings? We don't really know, but we think that it's just because he's angry. He doesn't want anybody else to have them. Even though he didn't create them, he manipulated the elves into creating these rings, and that if they're not doing their intended purpose of helping him control people, he's certainly not going to let people out there using them and benefiting from them. So as for how Thrain wound up there, I mean, even Gandalf said that he did not know how Thrain wound up in the Necromancer's dungeon. But the ring had to have been the reason that Sauron had any interest in Thrain II. And we know that he had an interest in the ring because the ring was the only thing he took. He did not take the key to Erebor. He did not take the map. He did not take anything else. And then he just threw Thrain into the pit, into the dungeons, and just basically forgot about him and let him slowly starve to death and go mad. And Gandalf found him, but it was sort of too late. He was barely coherent. He gave the key and the map to Gandalf and said, "Give these to my son." But at this point, Gandalf has no idea that this is Thrain II. He doesn't know who this guy is or who his son is, so he was carrying around the map and the key for quite some time before he figured it out. So when there's a mystery that even Gandalf says that he doesn't know, there's not really an explanation then, because Gandalf usually is the guy that knows. My best guess, though, is that he was traveling through Mirkwood, and the ring that he carried got the Necromancer's attention, and that he got captured there. That is the only way. Like at the very beginning of the story, when he says that he found Thrain in the dungeons of the Necromancer, Thorin said, "How did he wind up there?" And Gandalf basically said, "I don't know." Okay, so yes, that I can absolutely answer. I can absolutely answer that. So the Necromancer, nobody knew what he was, but the general opinion was that it was probably the Witch King. And that was what Saruman thought, and that's what Galadriel thought, and that's what Celeborn thought, and all these important people. And Gandalf was sort of the only person that disagreed and thought that it might be Sauron. And it's me and my friend Sid Kemp recently had this discussion. Well, not too recently. It was a few months ago, but we had this discussion about how many times did Gandalf go into the Necromancer's dungeon, into Dol Guldur, and for what purpose each time. And it's interesting because in The Lord of the Rings, he speaks about there being 2 different times he went. But in the Silmarillion, it's mentioned that he went a 3rd time. Or rather, a first time, I should say. Is that when Gandalf first heard about there being a Necromancer in Dol Guldur, he went there to investigate. And he came openly. And the Necromancer, sensing Gandalf, did not want to be identified. He did not want Gandalf to find out that he was Sauron, so he fled. He hid. He left for a while, made himself scarce. So Gandalf wasn't able to find out anything, and he left. But then he had the idea later to come back in disguise, to hide himself and to sneak in there, and that's when he found Thrain. And that's when he was able to positively ID that the Necromancer was, in fact, Sauron. The 3rd time, of course, was in force with Saruman and the rest of them, and that's happening as we speak. During this part of the story, they're just driving Sauron out of the forest right now. But yeah, he was there specifically because he had a suspicion that the Necromancer might have been Sauron. Saruman thought it was the Witch King. A lot of people assumed that the Necromancer was the Witch King. Because the Witch King had fled from Angmar and abandoned his whole kingdom up there after he'd been defeated by the Den of Arnor and Gondor, and the elves had all ganged up on him for a while. And he left. And nobody knew where he went. Now, we know where he went. He went to Mordor, but nobody in Middle-earth really knew where he meant. So when this dark presence pops up in the forest, and keep in mind, they think Sauron's long gone. Well, most people think that Gandalf is there specifically because of Sauron, so he's a little suspicious of this. He's the smart guy in the room, you know? So that's why he was there. He was finding things out. He was absolutely finding things out. He was finding out who this guy actually was, and he turned out to be right. Okay, let's continue here. As soon as the raft of barrels came in sight, boats rowed out from the piles of the town, and voices hailed the raft steerers. Then ropes were cast and oars were pulled. Thank you. And let's try that again. Then ropes were cast and oars were pulled, and soon the raft was drawn out of the currents of the forest river and towed away around the high shoulder of rock into the little bay of Lake Town. There it was moored not far from the shoreward head of the great bridge. Soon men would come up from the south and take some of the casks away, and others they would fill with goods they had brought to be taken back up the stream to the wood elves' home. In the meantime, the barrels were left afloat while the elves of the raft and the boatmen went to feast in Lake Town. They would have been surprised if they could have seen what happened down by the shore after they had gone by the shades of night had fallen. First of all, a barrel was cut loose by Bilbo and pushed to the shore and opened. Groans came from outside, and out crept a most unhappy dwarf. Wet straw was in his draggled beard. He was so sore and stiff, so bruised and buffeted, he could hardly stand or stumble through the shallow water to lie groaning on the shore. He had a famished and savage look, like a dog that had been chained and forgotten in a kennel for a week. It was Thorin, but you could have only told it by his golden chain, and the color of his now dirty and tattered sky-blue hood with its tarnished silver tassel. It was some time before he would even be polite to the hobbit. "Well, are you alive or are you dead?" asked Bilbo quite crossly. Perhaps he had forgotten that he had at least one good meal more than the dwarves, and also the use of his arms and legs, not to speak of a greater allowance of air. "Are you still in prison or are you free? If you want food, and if you want to get on with this silly adventure, it's yours after all, and not mine. You'd better slap your arms and rub your legs and try and help me get the others out while there's still a chance." Thorin, of course, saw the sense of this, so after a few more groans, he got up and helped the hobbit out as well as he could. In the darkness, floundering in the cold water, they had a difficult and very nasty job finding which were the right barrels. Knocking outside and calling, only discovered about 6 dwarves that could answer. These were unpacked and helped ashore while they sat or lay muttering and moaning. They were so soaked and bruised and cramped that they could hardly yet realize their release or be properly thankful for it. Dwalin and Balin were 2 of the most unhappy, and it was no good asking them to help. Bifur and Bofur were less knocked about and drier, but they lay down and would do nothing. Fili and Kili, however, who were young for dwarves, had also been packed more neatly with plenty of straw into smaller casks, came out more or less smiling, with only a bruise or 2 and a stiffness that soon wore off. "I hope I never smell the smell of apples again," said Fili. "My tub was full of it. To smell apples everlastingly when you can only scarcely move, and are cold and sick with hunger, is maddening. I could eat anything in the wide world now, for hours on end, but not an apple." So just to pause here very briefly, I just want to point out that they mentioned that Fili and Kili are young for dwarves, and you might wonder how young are they? I believe, without looking it up, I believe they're in their late 70s, which is, that's very old for a low man of Middle-earth. It would be considered middle-aged for a Númenórean. It would be considered like a teenager for an elf. For a hobbit, they would be considered, old, but not elderly. But for dwarves who generally live to about 250 years, I believe the youngest of the company, which is, I believe Fili is 77. Don't quote me on that because I could be wrong. Whereas the oldest is Thorin, who is 195, and you can't quote me on that because I know that's correct. So it's interesting. At this point in the timeline, Gloin's son, Gimli, is about 61 years old, and he was considered too young to go on the adventure, and that's why Gimli's not in this book. So you're too young for adventures, Gimli. You're only 61. All right. With the willing help of Fili and Kili, Thorin and Bilbo at last discovered the remainder of the company and got them out. Poor fat Bombur was asleep or senseless. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were waterlogged and seemed only half alive. They all had to be carried out one by one and laid helpless on the shore. "Well, here we are," said Thorin. "And I suppose we ought to thank our stars and Mr. Baggins. I'm sure he had a right to expect it, though I wish he could have arranged a more comfortable journey. Still, all very much at your service once more, Mr. Baggins. No doubt we shall feel properly grateful once we are fed and recovered. In the meanwhile, what now?" "I suggest Lake Town," said Bilbo. "What else is there?" Nothing else, of course, could be suggested. So leaving the others, Thorin and Fili and Kili and the hobbit went along the shore to the great bridge. There were guards at the head of it, but they were not keeping very careful watch, for it was so long since there had been any real need. Except for occasional squabbles about river trolls, they were friends with the wood elves. Other folks were far away, and some of the younger people in town openly doubted the existence of any dragon in the mountain, and laughed at the greybeards and gammers who said they had seen him flying in the sky in their young days. Gammer, by the way, is an old-timey English slang for grandfather, kind of related to gaffer. Gaffer is like a dad, and gammer is like a granddad. That being so, it is not surprising that the guards were drinking and laughing by a fire in their hut, and did not hear the noise, the unpacking of the dwarves, or the footsteps of the 4 scouts. Their astonishment was enormous when Thorin Oakenshield stepped in through the door. "Who are you, and what do you want?" they shouted, leaping to their feet and groping for weapons. "Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain," said the dwarf in a loud voice, and he looked it, in spite of his torn clothes and draggled hood. The gold gleamed on his neck and waist. His eyes were dark and deep. "I have come back. I wish to see the master of your town." Then there was a tremendous excitement. Some of the more foolish ran out of the hut as if they expected the mountain to go golden in the night and all the waters of the lake to turn yellow right away. The captain of the guard came forward. "And who are these?" he asked, pointing to Fili and Kili and Bilbo. "The sons of my father's daughter," asked Thorin. "Fili and Kili, the race of Durin, and Mr. Baggins, who has travelled with us out of the west." "If you come in peace, lay down your arms," said the captain. "We have none," said Thorin, and it was true enough. Their knives had been taken from them by the wood elves, and his great sword Orcrist too. Bilbo had his short sword hidden as usual, but he said nothing about that. "We have no need of weapons, who return at last to our own, as spoken of old, nor could we fight against so many. Take us to your master." I had to pause here just to mention that he refers to Thorin, that is, he refers to Fili and Kili as the sons of my father's daughters, which is a really roundabout way of saying they're his nephews. His sister Dis is the only dwarf woman to actually be named by Tolkien. And it's interesting is that in the television program, the prequel show, The Rings of Power, there is a prominent female dwarf by the name of Disa, which is a very similar name, just with an A at the end, that is Durin's wife. Okay, where were we? Oh. "He is at feast," said the captain. "Then all the more reason for taking us to him," burst in Fili, who was getting impatient at all these solemnities. "We are worn and famished after our long road, and we have sick comrades. Now make haste, and let us have no more of your words, or your master may have something to say to you." "Follow me, then," said the captain, and with 6 men about them, he led them over the bridge, through the gates, and into the marketplace of the town. There was a wide circle of quiet water surrounded by the tall piles on which were built the greater houses, and by long wooden quays with many steps and ladders going down to the surface of the lake. From one great hall shone many lights, and there came the sound of many voices. They passed its doors and stood blinking in the light, looking at long tables filled with folk. "I am Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain." "I return," cried Thorin in a loud voice from the door, before the captain could say anything. All leaped to their feet. The master of the town sprang from his great chair, but none rose in greater surprise than the raftmen of the elves who were sitting at the lower end of the hall. Pressing forward before the master's table, they cried, "These are the prisoners of our king that have escaped, wandering vagabond dwarves that could not give us any good account of themselves, sneaking through the woods and molesting our people." "Is this true?" asked the master. As a matter of fact, he thought it far more likely that the return of the king out of the mountain, if any such person had ever existed. "It is true that we were wrongfully waylaid by the Elvenking and imprisoned without cause as we journeyed back to our land," answered Thorin. "But lock nor bar may hinder the homecoming spoken of old, nor is this town in the Wood Elves' realm. I speak to the master of this town, of the men of the lake, not to the raftmen of the king." Then the master hesitated and looked from one to the other. The Elvenking was very powerful in these parts, and the master wished for no enmity with him, nor did he think much of old songs, given his mind to trade and trolls, to cargoes and gold, to which habit he owed his position. Others were of different mind, however, and quickly the matter was settled without him. The news had spread from the doors of the hall like fire through the town. People were shouting inside the hall and outside it. The quays were thronged with hurrying feet. Some began to sing snatches of old songs concerning the return of the king under the mountain. That it was Thror's grandson, not Thror himself, that had come back did not bother them at all. Others took up the song, and it rolled long and high over the lake. "The king beneath the mountain, the king of carven stone, the lord of silvered fountains, shall come into his own. His crown shall be upholden, his harp shall be restrung, his halls shall echo golden to songs of yore resung. The wood shall wave on mountains, and grass beneath the sun. His wealth shall flow in fountains, and the rivers golden run. The streams shall run in gladness, the lake shall shine and burn, all sorrow fail and sadness at the mountain king's return. So they sang, or very like that, only there was a great deal more of it, and there was much shouting, as well as the music of harps and of fiddles mixed up with it. Indeed, such excitement had not been known in the town in the memory of the oldest grandfather. The wood elves themselves had begun to wonder greatly and even be afraid. They did not know, of course, how Thorin had escaped, and they began to think their king might have made a serious mistake. As for the master, he saw there was nothing else for it but to obey the general clamor, for the moment at any rate, and to pretend to believe that Thorin was what Fili and Kili beside... Oh, sorry, I skipped a line there. That Thorin was what he said. So he gave up to him his own great chair, and set Fili and Kili beside him in places of honor. Even Bilbo was given a seat at the high table, and no explanation of where he came from, no songs had alluded to him, even in the obscurest way, was asked for in the general bustle. Soon afterwards the other dwarves were brought into the town amidst scenes of astonishing enthusiasm. They were all doctored and fed and housed and pampered in the most delightful and satisfactory fashion. A large house was given up to Thorin and his company, boats and rowers were put at their service, and crowds sat outside and sang songs all day or cheered if any dwarf showed so much as his nose. Some of the songs were old ones, but some of them were quite new and spoke confidently of the sudden death of the dragon and of cargoes of rich presents coming down the river to Lake Town. These were inspired largely by the master, and they did not particularly please the dwarves, but in the meantime they were well contented, and they quickly grew fat and strong again. Indeed, within a week they were quite recovered, fitted out in fine cloth of their proper colors, with beards combed and trimmed, and proud steps. Thorin looked and walked as if his kingdom was already regained and Smaug chopped up into little pieces. Then, as he had said, the dwarves' good feeling was again that the Hobbit grew stronger every day. There were no more groans or grumbles. They drank his health, and they patted him on the back, and they made a great fuss for him, which was just as well, for he was not feeling particularly cheerful. He had not forgotten the look of the mountain, nor the thought of the dragon, and he had been beside a shocking cold. For 3 days he sneezed and coughed, and he could not go out, even after his speeches at banquets were limited to "Thank you very much." In the meanwhile, the wood elves had gone back up the forest river with their cargoes, and there was a great excitement in the king's palace. I have never heard of what happened to the chief of the guards and the butler. Nothing, of course, is ever said about keys or barrels, while the dwarves stayed in Lake Town, and Bilbo was careful never to become invisible. Still, I dare say, more was guessed than was known, though doubtless Mr. Baggins remained a bit of a mystery. In any case, the king now knew the dwarves' errand, or thought he did, and he said to himself, "Very well, we'll see. No treasure will come back through Mirkwood without my having something to say in the matter, but I expect they will all come to a bad end and serve them right." He, at any rate, did not believe in dwarves fighting and killing dragons like Smaug, and he strongly suspected attempted burglary or something like it, which shows he was a wise elf and wiser than the men of the town, though not quite right, as we shall see in the end. He set out his spies about the shores of the lake, and as far northward along the mountain as they would go, and waited. At the end of a fortnight, Thorin began to think of departure. While the enthusiasm still lasted in the town, the time was to get help. It would not do to let everyone cool down with delay. So he spoke to the master and his counselors and said that soon he and his company must go on towards the mountain. Then, for the first time, the master was surprised and a little frightened, and he wondered if Thorin was, after all, really a descendant of the old kings. If he had never thought that dwarves would actually dare approach Smaug, but believed they were frauds who would sooner or later be discovered and turned out, he was wrong. Thorin, of course, was really the grandson of the king under the mountain, and there was no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge and recovery of his own. But the master was not sorry at all to let them go. They were expensive to keep, and their arrival had turned things into a long holiday in which business was at a standstill. Let them go and bother Smaug and see how he welcomes them, he thought. Certainly a Thorin Thrain, son of Thror's son, was what he said. You must claim your own. The hour is at hand, spoken of old. What help we can offer shall be yours, and we trust to your gratitude when your kingdom is regained. So one day, although autumn was now getting far on, and winds were cold, and leaves were falling fast, 3 large boats left Lake Town, laden with rowers, dwarves, Mr. Baggins, and many provisions. Horses and ponies had been sent round by circuitous paths to meet them at their appointed landing place. The master and his counselors bade them farewell for the great steps of the town hall that went down into the lake. People sang on the quays and out of the windows. The white oars dipped and splashed, and off they went north up the lake onto the last stage of their long journey. The only person thoroughly unhappy was Bilbo. Now, I want to point out the wording here, and if anybody finds this very familiar, let me know. But I just want to point out the first line of that last paragraph that I read. So one day, although autumn was now getting far on, and winds were cold, and leaves were falling fast, 3 large boats left Lake Town. So that actually wound up being somewhat adapted into a Led Zeppelin song called Thank You. And Thank You was very inspired by Tolkien's work. It directly mentions Gollum. It directly mentions Mordor. And alludes to Sauron, calls him the evil one. And the woman that is being... I'm sorry, not Thank You. Not Thank You. Ramble On. Thank You is also a little bit Tolkien related, but Ramble On. The woman that Robert Plant is singing about in that song is actually the One Ring. It's interesting. The first line: leaves were falling all around. Time I was on my way. Thanks to you, I'm much obliged. Such a pleasant stay. That's the first line of Ramble On. But now it's time for me to go. The autumn moon lights my way. That's the whole first part of the song right there. So it's interesting that you can see that Led Zeppelin, they often took influence from The Lord of the Rings or from The Hobbit. They had a song called Misty Mountain Hop. There was Ramble On. There was Thank You. Even Stairway to Heaven has allusions to Tolkien's work in it. Ramble On is the most... obvious one, and you can see that the whole first verse of the song is basically this part of The Hobbit right here. So chapter 11, I think we do have time. We only have like about 10 minutes or so left of stream time, but chapter 11, On the Doorstep, rather short chapter, so we'll get through it. But I wanted to show the illustration here. So let's put that on. This is J.R.R. Tolkien's illustration called The Front Gate. So we'll just put that up there. Okay. If you're on YouTube, you could pause the video, right? All right. Chapter 11, On the Doorstep. In 2 days going, they rode right up the long lake and passed out of the river running. And now they could all see the lonely mountain, towering grim and tall before them. The stream was strong, and they're going slow. At the end of the 3rd day, some miles up the river, they drew into the left or western bank and disembarked. Here they were joined by horses with other provisions and necessaries, and the ponies for their own use that had been sent to meet them. They packed what they could on the ponies, and the rest was made into a store under a tent, but none of the men of the town would stay with them, even for the night, so near the shadow of the mountain. Not at any rate until the songs have come true, said they. It was easier to believe in the dragon, and less easy to believe in Thorin in these wild parts. Indeed, their stories have no need of any guard. Their stores, I should say. Their stores had no need of any guard, for all the land was desolate and empty. So their escort left them, making off swiftly down the river and the shoreward paths, although the night was already drawing on. They spent a cold and lonely night, and their spirits fell. The next day they set out again. Balin and Bilbo rode behind, each leading another pony heavily laden beside them. The others were some way ahead, picking out a slow road, for there were no paths. They made northwest, slanting away from the river running, and drawing ever nearer and nearer to a great spur of the mountain that was flung out southwards toward them. It was a weary journey, and a quiet and stealthy one. There was no laughter or song or sound of harps, and the prides and hopes in which they had stirred in their hearts at the singing of old songs by the lake died away to a plodding gloom. They knew that they were drawing near to the end of their journey, and that it might be a very horrible end. The land about them grew bleak and barren, though once, as Thorin told them, it had been green and fair. There was little grass, and before long there was neither bush nor tree, and only broken and blackened stumps, to speak of ones long vanished. They had come to the desolation of the dragon, and they were come to the waning of the year. They reached the skirts of the mountains all the same without meeting any danger or any sign of the dragon, other than the wilderness he had made about his lair. The mountain lay dark and silent before them, and ever higher above them. They made their first camp on the western side of the great southern spur, which ended in a height called Ravenhill. On this there had been an old watch-post, but they dared not climb it yet. It was too exposed. Before setting out to search the western spurs of the mountains for the hidden doors on which all their hopes rested, Thorin set out a scouting expedition to spy out the land to the south, where the front gate stood. For this purpose he chose Balin and Fili and Kili, and with them went Bilbo. They marched under the grey and silent cliffs to the feet of Ravenhill. There the river, after winding a wide loop over the valley of Dale, turned from the mountains on its road to the lake, flowing swift and noisily. Its bank was bare and rocky, tall and steep above the stream, and gazing out from under the narrow water, foaming and splashing among many boulders, they could see in the wide valley shadowed by the mountain's arms the grey ruins of ancient houses, towers, and walls. "There lies all that is left of Dale," said Balin. The mountain sides were green with woods, and all the sheltered valley rich and pleasant in the days when the bells rang in that town. He looked both sad and grim as he said this. He had been one of Thorin's companions on the day the dragon came. They did not dare to follow the river much further toward the gate, but they went on beyond the end of the southern spur, until lying hidden behind a rock, they could look out and see the dark cavernous opening in a great cliff wall behind the arms of the mountain. Out of it the waters of the running river sprang, and out of it too there came a steam, and a dark smoke. Nothing moved in the waste save the vapor in the water, and every now and again a black and ominous crow. The only sound was the sound of stony water, but every now and again the harsh croak of a bird. Balin shuddered. "Let us return," he said. "We could do no good here, and I don't like these dark birds. They look like spies of evil." "The dragon is still alive, and in the halls under the mountain, then, or I imagine so from the smoke," said the hobbit. "That does not prove it," said Balin, "though I don't doubt you are right. But he might have gone away some time, or he might be lying out on the mountainside keeping watch. And still I expect smokes and steams would come out of the gates. All the halls within must be filled with this foul reek." With such gloomy thoughts, followed ever by croaking crows above them, they made their weary way back to the camp. Only in June they had been guests in the fair house of Elrond, and though autumn was now crawling towards winter, that pleasant time now seemed years ago. They were alone in the perilous waste without hope of further help. They were at the end of their journey, but as far as ever it seemed from the end of their quest. None of them had had much spirit left. Now, strange to say, Mr. Baggins had more than the others. He would often borrow Thorin's map and gaze at it, pondering over the runes and the message in the moon letters Elrond had read. It was he that made the dwarves begin the dangerous search on the western slopes for the secret door. They moved their camp then to a long valley, narrower than the great dale in the south where the gates of the river stood, and walled with lower spurs in the mountains. Two of these here thrust forward west from the main mass in long, steep-sided ridges that fell ever downwards toward the plain. On this western side there were fewer signs of the dragon's marauding feet, and there was some grass for their ponies. From this western camp, shadowed all day by cliff and wall until the sun had begun to sink toward the forest, day by day they toiled in parties, searching for paths up the mountainside. If the map was true, somewhere high above the cliff, at the valley's head, must stand the secret door. Day by day they came back to their camp without success. But at last, unexpectedly, they found what they were seeking. Fili and Kili and the hobbit went back one day among the valleys and scrambled among the tumbled rocks at its southern corner. About midday, creeping behind a great stone that stood like a pillar, Bilbo came on what looked like a rough steps going upwards. Following those excitedly, he and the dwarves found traces of a narrow track, often lost, often rediscovered, that wandered on to the top of the southern ridge, and brought them at last to a still narrower ledge, which turned north across the face of the mountain. Looking down, they saw that they were at the top of a cliff at the valley's head, and were gazing down on their own camp below. Silently clinging to the rocky wall on their right, they went in single file along the ledge, until the wall opened, and they turned into a little steep-walled bay, grassy-floored, still and quiet. Its entrance, which they had found, could not be seen from below because of the overhang of the cliff, nor from further off because it was so small that it looked like a dark crack, and no more. It was not a cave, and was open to the sky above, but at its inner end a flat wall rose up in that lower part, close to the ground, was as smooth and upright as mason's work, without a joint or a crevice to be seen. No sign was there of post or lintel or threshold, nor any sign of bar or bolt or keyhole, yet they did not doubt that they had found the door at last. They beat on it, they thrust and they pushed it, and they implored it to move. They spoke fragments of broken spells of opening, and nothing stirred. At last, out, they rested on the grass at its feet, and then at evening began their long climb down. There was excitement in the camp that night. In the morning they prepared to move once more. Only Bombur and Bombur were left behind to guard the ponies, and such stores as they had brought with them from the river. The others went down the valley, and up the newly found path, and so to the narrow ledge. Along this they could carry no bundles or packs, so narrow and breathless was it, with a fall of 150 feet beside them onto sharp rocks below. But each of them took a great coil of rope wound tight about his waist, and so at last, without mishap, they reached the little grassy bay. There they made their third camp, hauling up what they needed from below with their ropes. Down the same way they were able occasionally to lower one of the more active dwarves, such as Kili, to exchange such news as there was, or to take a share in the guard below, while Bombur was hauled up to the higher camp. Bombur would not come up either the rope or the path. "I am too fat for such fly-walks," he said. "I should turn dizzy and tread on my beard, and then you would be 13 again. And the knotted ropes are too slender for my weight." Luckily for him, that was not true, as you will see. In the meanwhile, some of them explored the ledge beyond the opening, and found a path that led higher and higher on to the mountains, but they did not dare to venture very far that way, nor was there very much use in it. Out up there a silence reigned, broken by no bird or sound except that of the wind in the crannies of stone. They spoke low and never called or sang, for danger brooded in every rock. The others who were busy with the secret of the door had no more success. They were too eager to trouble about the runes of the moonletters, but tried without resting to discover where exactly in the smooth face of the rock the door was hidden. They had brought picks and tools of many sorts from Lake Town, and at first they tried to use those, but when they struck the stone the handles splintered and jarred their arms cruelly, and the steel heads broke or bent like lead. Mining work, they saw clearly, was no good against the magic that had shut the door, and they grew terrified too of the echoing noise. Bilbo found sitting on the doorstep lonesome and wearisome. There was not a doorstep, of course, but they used to call the little grassy space between the wall and the opening a doorstep for fun, remembering Bilbo's words long ago at the unexpected party in his Hobbit hole, when he had said he could sit on the doorstep till they thought of something, and sit and think they did, or wandered aimlessly about, and glummer they became. Their spirits had risen a little at the discovery of the path, but now they sank into their boots, and yet they would not give up and go away. The Hobbit was no longer much brighter than the dwarves. He would do nothing but sit with his back to the rock face and stare away west through the opening, over the cliff, over the wide lands to the tall black wall of Mirkwood, and the distances beyond, in which he sometimes thought he could catch glimpses of the misty mountains, small and far. If the dwarves asked him what he was doing, he answered, "You said sitting on the doorstep and thinking would be my job. Not to mention getting inside, so I'm sitting and thinking." But I'm afraid he was not thinking very much of the job, but of what lay beyond the blue distance, the quiet western land and the hill, and his hobbit hole under it. A large gray stone lay in the center of the grass, and he stared moodily at it, or watched the great snails. They seemed to love the little shut-in bay with its walls of cool rock, and there were many of them of huge size crawling slowly and stickily along its side. So, the snail part is interesting, because if you remember what the Moonletter said, it said when the thrush knocks, and it's sort of Thror's way of saying that there are these giant snails by the door, and they're always sort of there, and that these birds, the thrushes, feed on these snails, and to break the shells, they knock the snails against the wall, and they do this at the time when the door could be opened. So it's sort of a riddle in the way. "Tomorrow begins the last week of autumn," said Thorin one day. "And winter comes after autumn," said Bifur. "And next year after that," said Dwalin, "and our beards will grow till they hang down the cliff to the valley before anything happens here. What is our burglar doing for us? Since he has got an invisible ring, and ought to be a specially excellent performer now, I am beginning to think he might go through the front gate and spy things out a bit." Bilbo heard this. The dwarves were on the rocks just above the enclosure where he was sitting, and said, "And good gracious," he thought, "so that is what they are beginning to think, is it? It is always poor me that has got to get them out of their difficulties, at least since the wizard left. Whatever am I going to do? I might have known that something dreadful would happen to me in the end. I don't think I could bear to see the unhappy Valley of Dale again. And as for that steaming gate... That night he was very miserable and hardly slept. Next day the dwarves all went wandering off in various directions, and some were exercising the ponies down below. Some were roving about the mountainside. All day Bilbo sat gloomily in the grass bay, gazing at the stone or out west through the narrow opening. He had a queer feeling that he was waiting for something. Perhaps the wizard will suddenly come back today, he thought. If he lifted his head, he could see a glimpse of the distant forest. As the sun turned west, there was a gleam of yellow upon its far roof, as if the light caught the last pale leaves. Soon he thought of the orange ball of the sun sinking towards the level of his eyes. He went to the opening, and there, pale and faint, was a thin new moon above the rim of the earth. At that very moment he heard a sharp crack behind him. There on the grey stone in the grass was an enormous thrush, nearly coal-black, its pale yellow breast freckled with dark spots. Crack! It had caught a snail and was knocking it on the stone. Crack, crack! Suddenly Bilbo understood. Forgetting all danger, he stood on the ledge and hailed the dwarves, shouting and waving. Those that were nearest came tumbling over the rocks as fast as they could along the ledge to him, wondering what on earth was the matter. The others shouted to be hauled up the ropes, except Bombur, of course. He was asleep. Quickly Bilbo explained. They all fell silent, the hobbit standing by the grey stone, and the dwarves with wagging beards watched impatiently. The sun sank lower and lower, and their hopes fell. It sank into a belt of red and cloud and disappeared. The dwarves groaned, but still Bilbo stood almost without moving. The little moon was dipping to the horizon. Evening was coming on. Then suddenly, when their hope was lowest, a red ray of sun escaped like a finger through a rent in the cloud. A gleam of light came straight through the opening into the bay and fell on the smooth rock face. The old thrush, who had been watching from a high perch with beady eyes and head cocked on one side, gave a sudden trill. There was a loud crack. A flake of rock split from the wall and fell. A hole appeared suddenly about 3 feet from the ground. Quickly, trembling lest the chance should fade, the dwarves rushed to the rock and pushed in vain. The key! Cried Bilbo. Where is Thorin? Thorin hurried up. The key! Shouted Bilbo. The key that went with the map! Try it now while there's still time. Then Thorin stepped up and drew the key on its chain from round its neck. He put it into the hole. It fitted, and it turned. Snap! The gleam went out, and the sun sank, and the moon was gone, and the evening sprang into the sky. Now they all pushed together, and slowly a part of the rock wall gave way. Long, straight cracks appeared and widened. A door 5 feet high and 3 broad was outlined, and slowly, without a sound, swung inwards. It seemed as if darkness flowed out like vapor from the hole in the mountainside, and deep darkness in which nothing could be seen lay before their eyes, a yawning mouth leading in and down. And this is where we will stop for the day. We got through quite a bit, and we only have a little bit left. This is what we have left right here. We have Chapter 12, Inside Information. Chapter 13, which is Not at Home. Chapter 14, which is Fire and Water. Chapter 15, which is The Gathering of the Clouds. Chapter 16, A Thief in the Night. Chapter 17, The Clouds Burst. You see the chapters get kind of shorter towards the end here. And Chapter 18, Return Journey. And then Chapter 19, The Last Stage, which is also a very short chapter. So I think we'll be able to finish this next time. But thank you for coming by. There's not a lot to say about that last chapter. It's just sort of like things just sort of happen. The thrush knocking, obviously, the sunlight hitting it and being able to see the keyhole. I have to believe that the keyhole is probably always there, but they can only be seen in certain light. Thank you, Ted. But we're going to get to some of the very best parts. Bilbo talking to the dragon, the Battle of 5 Armies, and all that stuff. Thank you so much for coming by, guys. I really enjoyed this. My throat is killing me now. Doing these reading streams is incredibly taxing on my voice, but I do them anyway. And I'm going to go over the schedule very briefly with you, the regular streaming schedule. Let me go ahead and stop the recording here because there's no reason for the regular streaming schedule to go up on my YouTube channel. So we'll stop that right here. And for those of you watching on YouTube, we'll see you guys next time.